The gold-devouring Immortal opened its mouth to release a thick pillar of golden light, which flashed through the air like a bolt of lightning, and within it were numerous translucent golden threads that were giving off a terrifying destructive aura. In the next instant, a resounding boom rang out as the pillar of golden light split apart into around a dozen smaller beams of light, each of which shot forth toward one of the azure Lewin bird projections. These beams of light were extremely fast, while the azure Lewin bird projections had been slowed down significantly, so the former was able to catch up to the latter in an instant. A string of thunderous explosions rang out as the beams of golden light were detonated in unison, transforming into radiant golden suns that released devastating auras of destruction, creating countless spatial rifts in the surrounding area. All of the azure Lewin bird projections were instantly destroyed amid the explosions of golden light, with the exception of a single one. This was the true azure Lewin bird, and its feathers were in a state of complete disarray, while the wound stretching from its chest to its lower abdomen had been split open and was once again bleeding profusely. Jin Tong was standing on the azure Lewin bird's back, and she was also riddled with injuries, with countless thin cracks lining her entire exoskeleton. As for Zhao Bai and Taoist Zai, they were nowhere to be seen, but numerous white and golden fragments could be seen littered throughout the nearby space. The azure Lewin bird threw up a mouthful of blood, but the defiance in its eyes didn't waver as it summoned its mantra-treasured axis once again. However, before it had a chance to do anything else, several dozen translucent golden threads suddenly appeared directly beneath it, then pierced through its body and emerged from its back before it had a chance to react. The azure Lewin bird's entire body instantly stiffened, while the mantra-treasured axis also abruptly ceased in its rotation. Immediately thereafter, the translucent golden threads converged forcefully, slicing the azure Lewin bird's body into countless pieces, all of which began raining down toward the ground below. Jin Tong wasn't struck by these translucent threads, but her expression changed drastically upon seeing this, and she immediately fled into the distance as a ball of golden light. However, before she was able to get very far, the translucent golden threads intertwined with one another to form a huge golden net, trapping her within it. Immediately thereafter, the gold-devouring Immortal appeared directly before her, then opened its mouth to release a burst of golden light that encompassed her entire body. A horrified look appeared on Jin Tong's face as she struggled with all her might, and golden light erupted out of her body, frantically attempting to keep the golden net at bay, but her efforts proved to be completely futile. A derisive sneer appeared on the gold-devouring Immortal's face, and it opened its mouth up wide, releasing a burst of golden light that sucked in Jin Tong in a flash. Trapped within the golden light, Jin Tong's body shrank down rapidly before vanishing into the gold-devouring Immortal's mouth. The gold-devouring Immortal hovered in midair with its eyes tightly shut, and the golden spirit domain around it rippled momentarily before vanishing into its body. Moments later, radiant golden light erupted out of its body, forming waves of golden light that swept forth in all directions alongside its tremendous aura, which was slowly elevating bit by bit. "I've finally found another one. Someday I will return to my full power," the gold-devouring Immortal murmured to itself, then closed its eyes once again. Ali. On the edge of a vast forest, there was a small mountain here that was lined with jagged rocks, and a green jade flying carriage was rapidly approaching from afar before crashing heavily down onto the ground like a shooting star. The entire mountain shuddered violently as countless rocks came tumbling down, raising an enormous cloud of dust. On the flying carriage, Hanley gave a muffled groan as he forcibly swallowed the mouthful of blood that had already gushed to the base of his throat. "Uncle, are you all right?" Jintong exclaimed in a concerned voice. Han Li waved a hand to indicate that he was fine. He then released his spiritual sense to scour the surrounding area momentarily, following which his brows furrowed slightly as he asked, Jintong, can you sense where the gold-devouring immortal is right now? Jintong hurriedly closed her eyes to focus on her spiritual connection with the gold-devouring immortal upon hearing this, and moments later, she reopened her eyes as a perplexed look appeared on her face. For some reason, it's not moving. It's still in the same place that it was originally at, and it doesn't appear to have moved at all. It's not chasing after us, Han Li asked as he swallowed a pill. No, But what? Han Li asked as he raised an eyebrow. Its spiritual sense and immortal spiritual power are all fluctuating violently in a very abnormal fashion. It's almost as if it's locked in a fierce battle, but that's clearly not the case. Why is that? Jintong mused with a puzzled expression. After a brief moment of contemplation, Han Li said, according to your description, I think it must have fallen into some type of powerful illusion. Illusion? How did it suddenly fall into an illusion? Jintong exclaimed. I don't know, but in any case this is good news for us. Let's keep going. We can't afford to delay here any longer, Han Li replied. Jintong immediately nodded in response. The flying carriage lit up once again, yet right as it was about to rise up into the sky, Han Li was suddenly struck by a rush of dizziness, following which a voice rang out within his consciousness. I've temporarily trapped that gold-devouring immortal for now, but the illusion will only last 20 years. At your current cultivation base, continuing onward will be no different from committing suicide, so I suggest that you turn back and go back to where you came from. Han Li was very alarmed to hear this voice, and he immediately channeled his spirit refinement technique to protect his own consciousness while asking internally, who are you, and why did you help me? However, there was no response to his question, and the dizzy sensation clouding his mind also faded. Han Li's brows furrowed tightly as he released his spiritual sense to scour the surrounding area, but he was unable to find anything amiss. Jintong was rather perplexed by Han Li's strange actions, and she asked, What's wrong, uncle? Han Li offered no reply as he stood rooted to the spot in a daze, seemingly contemplating something in silence. Moments later, he heaved a faint sigh and shook his head, and the flying carriage sped away into the distance at his behest. Ali. There was an enormous peach blossom forest countless kilometers away. Under an enormous ancient peach blossom tree in the forest was a massive bed chariot, reclined on top of which was a huge white fox. The fox had a shock of golden fur on its glabella, resembling a heavenly eye. Its eyes were slightly narrowed, making it appear as if it were half asleep, and its entire body was enshrouded in a faint glow, making it appear as if it were a fox deity. Not far away from the giant white fox was a gorgeous young girl in a short white dress. There was a slightly seductive quality to her stunning, beautiful features, which were currently displaying a concerned expression, and after some hesitation she asked, Esteemed patriarch, if you could trap that gold-devouring immortal, then why didn't you help him a bit more and kill it altogether? You know that I don't have any fondness for humans, Lair. If it isn't for the fact that he looked after you in the spirit domain realm, I would have already killed him for encroaching upon the territory of our spirit fox tribe. The white fox replied with a cold harumph. The girl that it had just referred to as Lair was none other than Liu Lair, who had spent much of her formative years with Han Li back in the spirit domain realm. But esteemed patriarch, that's enough, the white fox snapped as its eyes abruptly sprang open. I helped him this time not just to repay him for looking after you in the past, but also to sever the karma between you and him. This matter concerns your future cultivation, and while I do spoil you in other things, this is non-negotiable. If you refuse to accept this outcome, then I'll go and kill him right now to sever the karma at its roots. No, don't do that. I'm sorry, esteemed patriarch, Liu Lair hurriedly said in an alarmed manner. A hint of sympathy appeared on the white fox's face upon seeing her panicked reaction, and he sighed. Killing that gold-devouring immortal will incur severe consequences, even for me. I have no idea how that man made an enemy out of that gold-devouring immortal, but there's no need to worry. As long as he knows what's good for him and turns back, it won't be impossible for him to make it back to the nearest immortal region in 20 years. Liu Lair wasn't relieved at all to hear this, and the concern in her eyes only grew more pronounced. Ali, close to a year passed by in a flash. During this time, Han Li had continued to venture even deeper into the primordial land without pause. However, as they advanced in their journey, the primordial beasts that they encountered became more and more powerful. As a result, they had no choice but to slow down and proceed with caution. Even so, they had still inadvertently incurred the wrath of extremely formidable primordial beasts on several occasions, thereby forcing them to flee for their lives. Thankfully, none of these primordial beasts were anywhere near as persistent as the gold-devouring immortal, and at the very most, they would only pursue the flying carriage for a few days before giving up. Half a month ago, Han Li had flown the carriage into a valley in order to escape from a high zenith stage primordial beast. The valley was quite large, and there was a peaceful ancient forest inside. However, only after entering the valley did Han Li realize that it was littered with primordial beast carcasses. This was clearly a terrible sign, but before he had a chance to back out of the valley, countless vines converged from all directions to form a massive cage around the flying carriage. As it turned out, this forest was actually an incredibly powerful tree demon. In the end, Han Li was only able to escape from that ordeal after drawing upon the divine Devilbane lightning in his azure bamboo cloudswarm sword to conjure up a lightning teleportation formation. It was a bright and sunny day, and gusts of fierce wind were howling incessantly over a mountain with sparse vegetation, but a thin layer of mist remained lingering in the air despite the ferocity of the wind. Right at this moment, a streak of green light appeared in the distance, then rapidly approached the mountain before fading to reveal a green jade flying carriage. Han Li leaped down from the carriage, then inspected his surroundings briefly before making his way over to a large tree that was completely devoid of leaves. He sat down with his back against the tree, then took a pill before closing his eyes to rest. Jin Tong and Xiao Bai also descended from the flying carriage before arriving by his side. Both Han Li and Jin Tong appeared to be exhausted, and even Xiao Bai was hanging its head in a lethargic manner as it laid down onto the ground. Some time later, Han Li exhaled as he opened his eyes, and he was looking a lot more energized than before, but there was still a hint of concern in his eyes. After a brief hesitation, Jin Tong said, "It's already been over half a year, yet that thing still hasn't moved at all. It looks like whoever communicated with me back then had to have been an extremely powerful being. This is a late high zenith stage spirit insect, and even though its spiritual sense is its weakness, it's still an extraordinary feat to trap it in an illusion for so long. It appears the gold-devouring immortal really will be trapped in that illusion for 20 years, Han Li mused. Is that person really helping us? Jin Tong asked. That's hard to say for now, but given that this is the primordial land, anything is possible, Han Li replied in an ambiguous fashion. Even in the northern glacial immortal region, there was so much treachery going on. I don't think anyone in the primordial land would be so kind as to help us for no reason, Jin Tong sighed. I wouldn't say that's entirely accurate, Xiao Bai suddenly interjected. Many of the immortals of the immortal regions appear to be wise and benevolent on the surface, but behind the scenes, they're constantly engaging in treacherous dealings. In contrast, even though the primordial land is constantly ravaged by conflict, Everyone is much more forthcoming here. Shut your mouth, Jin Tong snapped as she slapped Xiao Bai on the top of its head. Have you forgotten what the beast race did to us after we helped them? You can't just focus on a single example. The beast race is only a tiny race on the outskirts of the primordial land. In contrast, the major primordial races are far more honorable, Xiao Bai countered. Han Li's eyes lit up slightly upon hearing mention of the major primordial races, and Jin Tong just so happened to spot the change in his expression, upon which she hurriedly asked, "Have you thought of something, uncle? Seeing as that person is able to trap the gold-devouring immortal for 20 years and was able to communicate directly into my consciousness without my detection, they have to at least be at the late high zenith stage, and they could even be a great encompassment stage being. I've never met anyone of such a lofty cultivation base, but there's a chance that they could be from one of the major primordial races mentioned by Xiao Bai just now," Han Li replied. "Does it really matter? As long as they're helping us, who cares if they come from a major primordial race or a smaller one? It would be great if they could trap the gold-devouring immortal for 200 years, even 2,000 years," Jin Tong said. Han Li was rather amused to hear this, and he jibed, "Why 2,000 years and not for the rest of eternity? If I can spend 2,000 years traveling and eating with you, there's a good chance I'll become even more powerful than that thing. Once that time comes, I'll wait for it to deliver itself to me so I can eat it. That would save me the trouble of having to search for it," Jin Tong replied in a confident manner. "Are you sure you're not the one who's going to be eaten?" Han Li asked in an exasperated voice. "For some reason, ever since I could remember, I've always had an innate urge to devour all of the other gold-devouring beetles that I encounter, and this urge became even stronger as that thing was pursuing us," Jin Tong replied with a serious expression. "Perhaps that's simply a mission that all gold-devouring beetles share," Han Li mused in a contemplative fashion. Jin Tong didn't really understand what that meant, but she didn't ponder it either as she asked, "What should we do from here, uncle? Maybe we should listen to whoever helped us and return to the northern glacial immortal region." "That's not an option. I'm definitely already a fugitive in the entire immortal region, so going back would be no different from suicide," Han Li said with a wry smile. "Then should we keep going forward?" Jin Tong asked. "After being chased by that gold-devouring immortal for so long, we've already completely diverged from the route that we were supposed to take. At our current cultivation bases, if we keep forging ahead blindly, we'll land ourselves in hot water sooner or later. We can't just ignore the advice of someone capable of trapping a late high zenith stage being in an illusion for 20 years, Han Li said. "Well, what can we do then? Surely you're not planning to just stay here and cultivate." "That's exactly what I intend to do," Han Li declared, much to the astonishment of both Jin Tong and Xiao Bai. "We're just going to stay here in the middle of nowhere. Is that supposed to be a joke? Besides, we won't be able to make any significant progress in our cultivation in 20 years anyway," Jin Tong said in a concerned manner. "There are no other feasible options. At this point, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and we can't retreat or advance, so we may as well take our chances here. At the very least, I think this is the best way to proceed," Han Li said. "In that case, I'll place my trust in you, uncle. You can go into seclusion and focus on your cultivation. I'll make sure you don't get disturbed," Jin Tong vowed as she puffed out her chest in a display of confidence, while Xiao Bai buried its own head under its two front paws, seemingly resigning itself to its fate. "There's no hurry. We haven't just been traveling aimlessly for the past half a year. During this time, I've been searching for a suitable place to go into seclusion, and I've made my choice, but it's not here," Han Li said with a smile. "Why not? There aren't any primordial beasts nearby. Isn't this a good place to cultivate in seclusion?" Jin Tong asked with a perplexed expression. Do you still remember that ravine that we recently passed by? Hanley asked. I do. It's not far away from the valley where that tree demon was. It was so dark, and even from really far away, it reeked of blood and baleful qi. Surely you're not planning to go into seclusion in there, Jin Tong exclaimed. That's right. Here in the primordial land, all of the formidable primordial beasts have their own territories, and generally speaking, they won't encroach upon the territories of others. That tree demon was extremely powerful, and that's why that other primordial beast stopped pursuing us as soon as we entered the tree demon's territory. As long as we stay in its territory, we won't be disturbed by other primordial beasts, Hanley explained. That sounds correct, but the tree demon isn't just going to allow us to cultivate on its territory, Jin Tong countered in a puzzled manner. I'm not sure if you noticed, but the tree demon's roots were spread out over the entire valley and even a large area outside the valley, but they didn't extend into that ravine. Do you know why that is? Hanley asked. Jin Tong hadn't noticed this at all, and she could only shake her head with an inquisitive expression. Water and sunlight are mandatory for the nourishment of all plant life, so plants generally prefer warm and humid environments. That applies even to plant demons. That ravine is extremely dark and completely devoid of sunlight, and that's why the tree demon wasn't willing to extend its roots there, Hanley explained. I see, Jintong replied with an enlightened expression. More importantly, the ravine is extremely abundant in baleful qi, and that's exactly what I need. All right, we've taken some time to rest. Let's set off for that ravine right away, Hanley declared. With that, the three of them flew onto the flying carriage, which sped away as a streak of green light. Around half a month later, the flying carriage drew to a halt in the sky above a ravine that was several dozen kilometers in length and several thousand feet wide. Han Li was standing at the front of the carriage, looking at the ravine down below with a hesitant expression. While he had already decided that this was going to be where he went into seclusion, there was still a major element of risk associated with this plan. The primordial land was rife with formidable beasts, and there was no guarantee that there weren't creatures even more powerful than the tree demon lurking in the ravine. Perhaps it wasn't the lack of sunlight that made the tree demon unwilling to spread its roots here. Instead, perhaps, it was weary of some other formidable being inside the ravine. Han Li shook his head to rid himself of those meddling thoughts. At this point, it was already too late to turn back. In the next instant, he swooped down into the ravine, and as soon as he entered its depths, he was immediately plunged into darkness. A nauseating bloody odor permeated throughout the entire ravine, alongside an extremely fearsome baleful aura. Han Li remained completely unfazed as he conjured up an azure light barrier around himself, and only after descending to a depth of close to 10,000 feet did he release his spiritual sense to scour the ravine. In doing so, he discovered that the ravine was far deeper than he imagined, and not only was it impossible to determine where its bottom laid, Han Li couldn't sense any living beings inside at all. He continued to descend rapidly along a sheer cliff face of the ravine, and the more he descended, the more alarmed he became. The cliff faces on either side of the ravine were riddled with jagged and uneven rocks, interspersed among which were slightly flatter and more even stone platforms that varied in size. Littered all over these jagged rocks and stone platforms were piles of skeletons that were burning with fluorescent green flames. There was a huge number of these skeletons, and just like the stone platforms, they also varied drastically in size. Han Li was rather confused to see this. Could it be that the baleful qi here was so abundant because this was where the tree demon had been discarding the skeletal remains of its victims? Around 15 minutes later, Han Li descended onto one of the stone platforms protruding out of the cliff face, and he swept a sleeve through the air to scatter the dozens of skeletons on the platform, sending them plunging down deeper into the ravine. Han Li briefly inspected his surroundings, then swept a sleeve through the air to summon Taoist Zai, Jin Tong, and Xiao Bai amid 3 streaks of light, 2 golden and 1 white. As soon as Jin Tong appeared, she was immediately struck by a sense of discomfort, and she hurriedly asked, "Where are we, uncle?" "There's an extreme abundance of baleful qi here," Taoist Zai remarked with tightly furrowed brows. "We're already deep within the ravine right now. This amount of baleful qi should still be tolerable for all of you, but if we go any deeper, you run the risk of suffering baleful qi contamination. So I'll leave all of you to stay here for now while I continue my descent," Han Li said. "Just focus on your cultivation and don't worry about anything else, uncle," Jin Tong declared with a reassuring nod. Han Li patted Jin Tong on the head, then turned to Taoist Zai as he said, "Brother Zai, as a safety precaution, I'll have to trouble you to set up a formation with me." Taoist Zai nodded in response. "Master, this feels like such an eerie place. Is it really all right to stay here?" Xiao Bai suddenly asked in a concerned manner. "Just as the baleful qi in here is unbearable for all of you, I'm sure the same applies to other primordial beasts as well. On top of that, my spiritual sense wasn't able to detect any living beings in here, so there shouldn't be any problems," Han Li replied. Xiao Bai nodded silently in response. "Jin Tong, even though that person told us that the gold-devouring immortal will be trapped for 20 years, we can't just take their word for it. Make sure to keep constant tabs on the gold-devouring immortal, and if it begins moving, notify me right away," Han Li instructed. "You can count on me, uncle," Jin Tong replied with a serious look on her little face. After that, Han Li flipped a hand over to produce a formation plate, following which he and Taoist Zai sprang into action, flying over the cliff faces of the ravine to set up a formation. "Back when I was with Gling, I was always the one doing the hunting, but now that I'm back with Uncle, I've suddenly become the one being hunted," Jin Tong suddenly remarked. "Are you regretting returning to Master's side?" Xiao Bai asked. Jin Tong slapped it on the head as she smiled and said, "How could I possibly regret it when being with Uncle is so exciting? Besides, Uncle will definitely find a way out of this predicament, I'm sure of it." A faint smile appeared on Xiao Bai's face upon hearing this. Ali. A few minutes later, Han Li parted ways with Taoist Zai and Jin Tong, then continued his descent deeper into the ravine. As he did so, the gusts of wind were sweeping through the air beside him, picking up specks of fluorescent flames from the nearby skeletons before blowing them in different directions. These specks of green flames resembled stars in the night sky, except they were far more eerie and unsettling to behold. The deeper Han Li descended into the ravine, the more perplexed he became. He had thought that there would be an even distribution of baleful qi throughout the entire ravine, but as it turned out, the deeper he went, the denser the surrounding baleful qi became, and strangely enough, the number of skeletal carcasses on the cliff faces on either side were also becoming fewer and fewer. After descending for about 30 kilometers, all traces of light ceased to exist, and the baleful qi in the surrounding area was so dense that it felt like a suffocating blanket. At this point, even Han Li was beginning to feel very uncomfortable, despite the fact that he had previously used baleful qi to open up some of his immortal acupoints. His brows furrowed slightly as he fought through the discomfort and continued his descent. As he descended, the surrounding baleful qi only continued to grow denser and denser, and even the protective spiritual light around him wasn't able to completely keep it at bay. As he neared the 50-kilometer mark, the surrounding baleful qi suddenly began to churn violently, and gusts of howling yin wind swept through the air. The nearby air temperature also plummeted drastically, and a layer of black ice crystals appeared over the cliff faces, while some sections had been so badly frozen that the rock had cracked and split apart. Han Li was caught completely off guard, and a thick layer of black ice emerged over his body, while all types of violent and aggressive thoughts forced their way into his mind. All of a sudden, he found himself seeing red, and he felt as if he had been transported to a battlefield riddled with vast mountains of demon beast carcasses and rivers of blood. At the same time, a chorus of ghostly howls rang out beside his ears. Before he had a chance to do anything, countless crimson ghostly hands extended out of the mountains of carcasses and rivers of blood, attempting to tear away his sanity. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this, but he remained in a state of lucidity. He was aware of the detrimental effects that baleful qi contamination could have on one's spiritual sense, and he had already channeled his spirit refinement technique to protect his own mind. He closed his eyes while focusing on channeling the spirit refinement arts, and a cool and refreshing sensation welled up in his mind, while the horrific illusion of the battlefield began to fade. However, gusts of yin wind were still sweeping incessantly through the area, and while the illusion was fading, it refused to disappear altogether. Han Li gave a cold harumph as he channeled his spirit refinement technique several more times, and the illusion was finally completely dispelled. With that, he gently exhaled, following which the layer of black ice crystals around him was shattered amid a flash of azure light. However, instead of continuing his descent from there, he peered down into the ravine with a wary look in his eyes. The baleful qi here was far more formidable than he had anticipated, and if any other mid-golden immortal cultivator who hadn't cultivated the spirit refinement technique had been in his place, they would have most likely already been driven insane by the illusion from just now. Gusts of yin wind were howling incessantly down below alongside clouds of churning black mist, and it was clear that he was far from reaching the bottom of the ravine. On top of that, the boundless baleful qi and yin wind here severely obstructed his spiritual sense, thereby restricting his spiritual sensory range. He was originally planning to reach the bottom of the ravine to take advantage of the more abundant baleful qi there to assist in his cultivation, but at this point, he had already reached his limits, and descending any further could result in a complete loss of his sanity. If the same illusion from before were to present itself to him again in an even stronger form, then he wasn't confident that he would be able to overcome it. Right as he was hesitating about how to proceed, he suddenly raised an eyebrow as a hint of elation appeared in his eyes. He had discovered that by overcoming the earlier illusion through channeling his spirit refinement technique, he had made some significant progress in his spirit refinement technique, equivalent to the progress that he had made over the past few years of cultivation. In this environment, his spiritual sense was constantly on the verge of collapse, and it seemed that this was greatly beneficial for the cultivation of the spirit refinement technique. His original plan was only to take advantage of the baleful qi in this place to open up more immortal acupoints, so this discovery was certainly a pleasant surprise. It was extremely rare to see such a vast abundance of baleful qi in any place, and this only made him even more curious about what was at the bottom. Moments later, Han Li decided to continue in his descent. This time, he was only able to descend a few more kilometers before the effects of baleful qi contamination began to rear their ugly heads again, and he immediately drew to a halt while simultaneously channeling his spirit refinement technique. The same illusion of the horrific battlefield had surfaced in his mind, and this one was even stronger than the one from before. Han Li was channeling his spirit refinement technique with all his might to withstand the illusion, and only after close to an entire day had passed did he finally exhale before opening his eyes. Just as he had anticipated, he had made significant progress in the spirit refinement technique once again. A hint of elation surfaced in his eyes, and at this rate, it wasn't going to take long before he fully mastered the fourth level of the spirit refinement technique. After taking a brief rest, he continued his descent. The more he descended, the more formidable the surrounding baleful qi and yin wind became, and it was as if this ravine were connected directly to the depths of hell. Just like before, Han Li would periodically stop at certain points, using the yin wind and baleful qi to assist him in his cultivation of the spirit refinement technique, and using this method, he was able to make rapid progress. Several months later, Han Li had already reached the pinnacle of the 4th level of the cultivation art. He was only one step away from full mastery. At this moment, he was standing on a giant rock protruding out of the cliff face, looking down into the ravine below. By his estimates, he had already descended close to 500 kilometers into the ravine, yet he still didn't appear to be close to the bottom. He briefly inspected his surroundings, and after some contemplation, he began to descend again. A short while later, he stopped in his tracks with a surprised expression. At this point, the ravine had become very narrow, and gusts of yin wind were sweeping through the area, stirring up the nearby baleful qi to form a series of vortexes of different sizes. The baleful qi here was several times more formidable than before, and the gusts of yin wind were also blowing with increased ferocity. Bursts of violent intent forced their way into Han Li's mind, and even though he was constantly channeling his spirit refinement technique, he was struggling to retain his sanity. Before he had a chance to do anything else, an incredibly thick pillar of yin wind suddenly erupted out of the ravine down below before sweeping up his entire body. A burst of extremely formidable baleful qi surged out of the pillar of yin wind, instantly shattering the defenses of the spirit refinement technique in his mind. A burst of fierce killing intent instantly flooded into Han Li's mind. His eyes quickly turned bloodshot while his vision blurred, and he was once again thrust into another illusion. All around him was a sea of blood, with countless demon beast skeletons and carcasses submerged within, and the entire surrounding area was filled with the nauseating stench of blood and gore. Han Li immediately bit down onto the tip of his own tongue, using the pain to help him recover some of his lucidity. At the same time, he was channeling his spirit refinement technique to protect his own mind as much as possible, but as he swept his gaze over his surroundings, his pupils instantly contracted slightly. The previous illusions had been able to affect his mind, but they were still tolerable, and he was able to free himself from them by channeling the spirit refinement technique. However, this illusion was different. He seemed to have fallen completely into it, and it wasn't going to be so easy to break free. Even though he was doing everything in his power to cling to his sanity, he could feel all of the blood in his entire body churning violently, and a wave of irrepressible fury rose up in his heart with such ferocity that it felt as if it were about to tear his chest apart. He had experienced something like this before, back when he had been struck by that abrupt onset of spirit refinement technique backlash in the Black Wind Sea. However, that problem should have already been ironed out through his cultivation of the 4th level of the spirit refinement technique, at least on a temporary basis. Could it be that this illusion was forcibly triggering premature backlash from his spirit refinement technique? With that in mind, Han Li hurriedly channeled the spirit refinement technique with all his might, and a cool and refreshing sensation coursed through his mind to slowly snuff out the fury in his heart. After that, he began to ponder how he could break free from this illusion. Right at this moment, a burst of splashing rang out nearby, and Han Li turned to discover that a demonic wolf carcass that was over 100 feet in length had slowly stood up within the sea of blood not far away. 2 specks of eerie red light appeared in its eye sockets, and it let loose a ferocious roar before pouncing at Han Li, who flicked a finger through the air, releasing a streak of azure light to slice the demonic wolf carcass in half. Immediately thereafter, 2 more demon beast carcasses rose to their haunches before launching themselves at Han Li, and they were also promptly slain. However, before Han Li had a chance to do anything else, more and more carcasses came pouncing at him from all directions, and he was forced to retaliate, striking them down one after another. Initially, these carcasses weren't all that powerful, but as more and more of them sprang to life, they also became progressively more formidable, and before long, there were even some true immortal and golden immortal stage demon beast carcasses among their ranks. At this point, Han Li had already adopted his giant mountain ape form, and he was swinging his enormous golden fists through the sea of blood around him, eradicating all of the surrounding carcasses. However, there seemed to be no end to these carcasses, and it didn't take long before he was completely surrounded. Right at this moment, a green tail that was over 1,000 feet in length abruptly emerged from the sea of blood down below, then swept toward him with tremendous force. Han Li was busy warding off other attacks, so he could only launch a hurried punch at the sweeping tail to release a golden fist projection, and a resounding boom rang out as the fist projection clashed against the giant tail, upon which the former was instantly shattered like an egg. As for the massive tail, it wasn't even slowed down in the slightest as it crashed straight into Han Li's side, sending him flying like a rag doll into the throngs of demon beast carcasses in that direction. The nearby carcasses immediately began roaring with excitement as they piled onto all at once, completely inundating him before tearing at his flesh in a frenzy. The giant mountain ape was normally renowned for its incredible physical constitution, yet in this moment, its defenses had become extremely frail, and almost in the blink of an eye, most of its flesh had been torn away, revealing the bone underneath. Han Li was furious, and his arms glowed with radiant golden light as he lashed out in all directions. A burst of tremendous power erupted out of the golden light, causing the surrounding space to warp and rumble violently. All of the nearby carcasses were sent flying, while the giant golden ape sprang up to a higher elevation, allowing it temporarily free itself from the encirclement. Han Li looked down at his own severely ravaged body, and the fury in his eyes gradually faded. Even though half of his body had gone missing, he didn't feel as if he had suffered any severe injuries, and his body instantly reverted back to normal amid a flash of golden light. He immediately realized that he had been swept up in the heat of the moment, and as a result, he had forgotten that he was in an illusion. Of course, the main reason why he had almost fallen prey to the illusion was the mental disturbance that had been caused by the premature onset of spirit refinement technique backlash. If he were to allow himself to get lost in this illusion, then he would never be able to break free from it. Before he had a chance to ponder the subject any further, all of the demon beast carcasses came springing up at him once again from down below. Han Li exhaled as he closed his eyes while channeling his spirit refinement technique with all his might, paying no heed to all of the converging carcasses. A glimmer of translucent light emerged on his glabella, then quickly expanded and grew brighter until it was as radiant and blinding as the sun. The group of demon beast carcasses that were charging at the forefront were only around 10 feet away from Han Li at this point, and as soon as the translucent light shone upon them, they immediately began screeching with agony before being reduced to dust in the blink of an eye. The rest of the demon beast carcasses hurriedly shot back in retreat upon seeing this, flying deep into the sea of blood, not daring to show themselves again. All of a sudden, not a single carcass could be seen, and all that remained was the sea of blood peacefully rippling around him. Moments later, Han Li's eyes abruptly sprang open, and there was radiant golden light glowing within them. His gaze quickly roamed over the surrounding area, following which a thick beam of translucent light erupted out of his glabella, forming a giant translucent blade that was over 1,000 feet in length before striking the space directly up ahead. The crimson space in the path of the translucent blade rippled momentarily, but then instantly returned to normal. Even though Han Li was unable to tear the space open, he was very much encouraged to see this, and his glabella lit up once again, but right at this moment, the sea of blood down below suddenly began to churn and bubble violently. Immediately thereafter, a mountainous green carcass slowly began to emerge from the depths. The carcass belonged to an enormous green rat with an almost entirely decomposed body. There were two balls of green and red flames burning within its eye sockets, presenting a very peculiar sight to behold, and there was a massive green tail that was just as long as the rat itself trailing along behind it. The giant green rat was giving off an enormous aura that caused the nearby space to tremble and groan incessantly, as if the very space itself were unable to bear the enormity of its aura. The aura of the green rat was far more formidable than that of the high zenith stage Gourd devouring Immortal, and among all of the powerful beings that Han Li had seen, perhaps only Immortal Lord Myro could compare with it. Despite his alarm, Han Li didn't panic. Regardless of how formidable this giant green rat was, it was nothing but an illusion. Upon spotting the tail trailing along behind the rat, he immediately realized that this was the very same tail that had sent him flying earlier. Right at this moment, the giant rat's eyes lit up, and it pounced at Han Li as an enormous green shadow. Han Li immediately made a hand seal, and a thick pillar of translucent light shot out of his glabella before striking the green rat directly on the head. However, the giant rat merely opened its mouth to swallow the pillar of light, and it wasn't slowed down in the slightest as it crashed straight into Han Li like an enormous meteorite. Han Li's glabella lit up once again, and a huge shield of translucent light was conjured up in front of him. However, as soon as the translucent shield took shape, it was instantly shattered, following which a burst of tremendous force crashed into Han Li's body, sending him flying for close to 10 kilometers before he was finally able to steady himself. Before he had a chance to retaliate, a long green shadow shot forth like lightning before piercing straight through his body. The green shadow had come out of the giant rat's mouth, and it appeared to be the rat's tongue, but there was a layer of green flames burning over it. Han Li instantly felt a burst of scorching pain flare up in his mind, as if his entire soul were being incinerated, and he couldn't help but give a muffled groan. However, he was able to suppress the pain as he reached out with both hands to grab onto the green tongue, but before he could rip the tongue into two, it wrapped itself around his hands like a spirit snake, then rapidly wrapped itself around the rest of his body as well. Immediately thereafter, the green rat opened its mouth to produce a burst of immense suction force that acted upon Han Li, while its tongue was also rapidly retracted. In the blink of an eye, Han Li was sucked into the giant rat's mouth. His vision blurred momentarily, following which he found himself in a dark space, surrounded by decomposing chunks of dark purple flesh, which were constantly exuding putrid and nauseating pus. Bursts of tremendous force were also compressing toward him from all directions, and he remained firmly tied up by the green tongue. Han Li fought back his disgust as he struggled with all his might, but to no avail, and his heart immediately sank. However, he then suddenly ceased all struggles and closed his eyes, seemingly resigning himself to his fate. All of a sudden, bursts of green flames appeared all around him, and they landed upon his body, setting him alight. The green flames were giving off incredible heat that directly scorched Han Li's soul, and the pain was so unbearable that he couldn't help but give a muffled groan. Han Li gritted his teeth in agony before abruptly letting loose a thunderous roar, and a shimmering golden nascent soul suddenly emerged from the top of his head. The nascent soul had a grim look on its face, and it rubbed its hands together, following which a burst of golden light flashed through its eyes before it vanished into Han Li's body again. In the next instant, Han Li felt a cool and refreshing sensation spreading through his spiritual sense, slightly counteracting the scorching pain that was ravaging his soul. However, the heat radiating from the green flames was only becoming more and more intense, and it was impossible to alleviate, even as Han Li channeled his spirit refinement technique with all his might. At this point, Han Li had already conjured up his true extreme film to help him withstand the tremendous compressive force that was acting upon him from all directions. But he was still trembling uncontrollably, while cracks and pops were ringing out incessantly from within his body, as if all of his bone were about to be shattered. Time passed by in an agonizingly slow fashion. All of a sudden, Han Li shuddered as a twisted look appeared on his face. The heat in his spiritual sense had risen to a terrifying degree, and he felt as if his entire soul were slowly shrinking amid the unbearable heat. His consciousness slowly began to blur, as if it were slowly leaving his body, but right at this moment, what appeared to be the sound of something shattering rang out deep within his soul. A speck of translucent light then abruptly emerged somewhere in his spiritual sense, and it began to release a burst of suction force. The scorching heat that permeated throughout his spiritual sense seemed to have suddenly found an outlet, and it surged toward the speck of translucent light in a frenzy to form a scorching vortex. In the span of just a few seconds, all of the scorching heat in Han Li's mind had faded, and the twisted look on his face also disappeared. Immediately thereafter, a resounding boom rang out from within his soul, and it was rapidly being enhanced and elevated to a whole new level. Only after around 15 minutes had passed did these changes gradually subside, and everything returned to normal. Han Li slowly opened his eyes, and he was ecstatic to discover that not only had his consciousness returned to normal, his spiritual sense had become 2 to 3 times more powerful than before. It was as if there were countless glittering and translucent streams flowing through his mind, giving off tremendous spiritual sense fluctuations. Never had he anticipated that he would achieve full mastery of the 4th level of the spirit refinement technique, while on the brink of disaster. Perhaps the reason why he hadn't been able to reach this step up to this point was because his spiritual sense was too powerful, so he had never been in a situation where his soul had been on the verge of collapse. In his desperation to attain more power in order to stand a chance against the gold-devouring Immortal, he had ventured deep into this mysterious ravine, and in an enormous stroke of luck, it had allowed him to achieve full mastery of the 4th level of the spirit refinement technique. Han Li swept his gaze over his surroundings, following which his glabella began to glow brightly, and bursts of radiant translucent light shot out from within like sharp swords in all directions. All of a sudden, bursts of blinding translucent light erupted out of the giant green rat's body, following which it exploded violently into streams of green light that flew away in all directions. Before long, Han Li was revealed, having already reverted back to his human form. Piercing translucent light was radiating from his body, illuminating the surrounding crimson space. All of a sudden, he made a hand seal, and the translucent light converged to form an enormous sword that was able to instantly slice the crimson space apart. Han Li's vision blurred momentarily, and in the next instant he found himself back in the dark ravine. He gently exhaled as he inspected his surroundings momentarily, then descended onto a nearby protruding cliff before sitting down with his legs crossed. With his current drastically enhanced spiritual sense, the surrounding yin wind and baleful qi were no longer able to affect him. He closed his eyes to carefully experience the enormous spiritual sense in his mind, and he was ecstatic with what he saw. Moments later, his eyes abruptly sprang open, and a burst of translucent light flashed over his glabella, following which a radiant translucent sword projection shot forth, vanishing into the black mist in a flash before racing up the ravine. High up in the sky above the ravine, a true immortal stage azure eagle was flying past, when the translucent sword projection suddenly pierced straight into its head, and it was only able to muster up a cry of shock and agony before the light in its eyes completely faded. At the same time, its aura also vanished, and its lifeless body tumbled down into the forest that was actually the body of the tree demon. The vines and branches in the forest immediately awakened, and they converged to ensnare the body of the azure eagle in a cocoon, following which a string of grotesque crunching sounds rang out. Inside the ravine, a hint of elation flashed through Han Li's eyes. With his significantly enhanced spiritual sense, his sword observation art had become several times more powerful, making it an even more effective weapon against the gold-devouring Immortal. After that, he tested out a few more spiritual attacks, all of which had also become immensely more powerful. Following his experimentation, he closed his eyes once again, and moments later, several translucent chains shot out of his glabella, then quickly intertwined with one another to form a rectangular cage. The chains were riddled with barely distinguishable black runes that were giving off a faint black glow, which intertwined with the translucent light emanating from the chains, presenting a rather peculiar sight to behold. Han Li cast his gaze toward the cage of chains, which was hovering in midair, then pointed a finger in its direction, and the cage instantly split back up into several translucent chains before vanishing into thin air. Deep within the forest outside the ravine was a huge tree that stood at several thousand feet tall. The tree had an extremely dense canopy, and the trunk was as green as jade, as were all of its branches and leaves. Furthermore, there was an enormous face on the trunk of the tree. At this moment, the eyes of the face were tightly shut, and a snoring sound was coming out of its half-agape mouth, indicating that it seemed to be sleeping. Right at this moment, several translucent chains emerged beside the tree amid a burst of spatial fluctuations, then vanished into the tree in a flash. The giant face on the tree instantly opened its eyes as it let loose a roar of alarm and fury, and its thick branches began to flail around violently like arms. At the same time, an immense high-zenith stage aura erupted out of its body, and bursts of green light shot out of the tree's trunk in a frenzy before landing in the nearby valley. Everything that came into contact with this green light was instantly destroyed, and the earth in a radius of several hundred kilometers rumbled and quaked violently, sending huge clouds of dust rising up into the air. However, in the next instant, the flailing branches of the giant tree suddenly stopped moving, and the expression on its face also abruptly stiffened, but the radiant green light glowing from the tree and its immense aura still remained. Deep within the giant tree was a green space that was filled with dense green mist, and hovering at the center of the mist was a green soul in the form of a humanoid tree. However, at this moment, the soul was trapped in a cage formed by translucent chains, and the cage was giving off a layer of translucent light that isolated the green soul from the sea of mist outside. The green soul was struggling frantically within the cage, taking on all types of different forms to try and break free, but no matter what it tried, its efforts proved to be completely futile. After briefly trapping the soul for some time, the cage suddenly split back up into several translucent chains that vanished into thin air. The tree demon was instantly able to move again, and a confused look appeared in its eyes as it scoured its surroundings in a perplexed fashion. Ali, deep within the ravine. The translucent chains appeared beside Han Li in a flash, then immediately vanished into his body. His complexion was rather pale, but there was a hint of elation on his face. That cage just now was a secret technique called the spiritual sense cage, which could only be unleashed after mastering the fourth level of the spirit refinement technique. It was capable of trapping enemy souls to temporarily sever the connection between their body and their soul. While it was true that the tree demon had been caught completely off guard, The fact that this secret technique was able to temporarily seal away the soul of a high zenith stage being was still a testament to its immense power. After taking a brief moment to catch his breath, Han Li's complexion gradually began to recover, and a contemplative look appeared in his eyes. The secret technique was very powerful, but it was also extremely taxing on his spiritual sense. Even though he had only unleashed it for a very short time, only 30% of his spiritual sense remained, and it was going to take at least a month for him to recover. However, this was still very much a worthy trade. After sitting in silence for a moment, Han Li summoned a black jade slip before injecting his spiritual sense into it. This jade slip contained the 5th level of the spirit refinement technique. The spirit refinement technique was far more powerful than Han Li had anticipated. Originally, he had been planning to take advantage of the vast abundance of baleful qi here to open up more immortal acupoints, but it seemed like cultivating the spirit refinement technique was actually the better option. After reading through the entire 5th level of the spirit refinement technique, Han Li's brows furrowed slightly with concern. The contents of the 5th level were far deeper and more difficult to grasp than the 4th level. Having said that, Han Li had seen countless profound cultivation arts in the past, and no matter how difficult the 5th level was to grasp, it had to be a continuation of the 4th level, so it shouldn't be a problem for him to interpret it as long as he was willing to spend the time. With that in mind, he injected his spiritual sense into the jade slip once again. Around an hour ago, right when Han Li achieved full mastery of the 4th level of the spirit refinement technique. Countless kilometers away from the ravine that Han Li was in, there stood a white mountain that reached all the way up into the clouds. On the mountain summit was an azure platform that had been constructed out of stone blocks, and at the center of the platform was a square stone table, around which were placed 4 stone chairs of the same style, but in different colors. At this moment, 3 of the stone chairs were occupied. One of them was occupied by a black-robed young man with a dark complexion. He had a pair of silver horns on his head, and there was a very cold and inhospitable air about him. The second chair was occupied by a white-robed man who appeared to be 30 to 40 years of age. He was extremely handsome, with a head of flowing white hair, down the middle of which was a lock of eye-catching golden hair. The final person to complete the trio was a hunchbacked elderly man with red hair and a red beard, holding a crimson cane in one hand. Hovering above the stone table in front of the trio was a white mirror of water, within which was a swirling expanse of white light. A dark ravine could just barely be made out beneath the white light, and there were wisps of black qi drifting out of the ravine. Those are some very powerful spiritual sense fluctuations. Could it be that someone on Old Man Gu's territory made a breakthrough to the great encompassment stage? The black-robed young man mused. A breakthrough to the great encompassment stage would have triggered far more significant phenomena. If you ask me, this looks like something that would arise from someone cultivating some type of spiritual secret technique, the white-robed man said. The black-robed man's brows furrowed slightly as he took a glance at the white-robed, then gave a cold harumph. The white-robed man paid no heed to him as he turned to the red-haired elderly man and asked, "What do you think, brother you? I'm not too sure what to make of this, but seeing as this is happening on fellow Taoist Gu's territory, we're in no position to intervene," the red-haired man replied in an ambiguous fashion. Today is our once-in-a-million-year gathering, yet fellow Taoist Gu has already been absent several times in succession, and now something strange seems to be happening on his territory. I really do wonder what he's up to, the white-robed man sighed as he shook his head with a resigned smile. Don't mind him, fellow Taoist Gu has always been a very mysterious man, the red-haired elderly man chuckled. Maybe you should mind your own business instead of prying into Old Man Gu's matters, Brother Liu. Recently, One of your subsidiary branches in the Dark Star Mountain Range suddenly attacked and took over the entire insect race territory in that area. How do you explain that, Brother Liu? The black-robed young man asked. So that's what's on your mind. I was wondering why you were being so hostile to me. Both of us have countless descendants spread across the vast primordial land, and they've always lived and died by the laws of natural selection. So why concern yourself with these matters? If you're truly bothered by this, then just send some of your people to recover the territory, the white-robed man replied with a nonchalant smile. In that case, I don't believe there's any need for this gathering to drag on any longer. I'll be going ahead now, the black-robed man declared as he suddenly rose to his feet, then abruptly vanished into thin air. Looks like Brother Zhu's temper is still as fiery as ever. Brother Liu, I'll also be taking my leave now. See you in a million years, the red-haired elderly man said as he also rose to his feet, then waved his cane through the air, and a white spatial rift appeared in front of him, then slowly widened to form a spatial passageway. After that, the red-haired elderly man calmly stepped into the spatial passageway and departed as well. Meanwhile, a faint smile appeared on the white-robed man's face as he mused. That human brat is quite brave. He's neither advancing or retreating, instead choosing to remain where he is to cultivate. Let's see if he has what it takes to dig himself out of this hole. As soon as his voice trailed off, the white mirror hovering above the platform abruptly vanished, and the white-robed man was also nowhere to be seen. It took Han Li around half a month to fully comprehend the fifth level of the spirit refinement technique. His spiritual sense was far superior to that of the average golden immortal to begin with, and now that he had mastered the fourth level of the spirit refinement technique, he naturally fulfilled the spiritual sense prerequisites to cultivate the fifth level of the spirit refinement technique. However, the fifth level of the cultivation art was extremely complex, and it seemed that many risks also had to be taken during its cultivation, and that left him a little hesitant about how to proceed. However, given the impact that the baleful qi in the ravine had on his spiritual sense, it occurred to Han Li that perhaps he could further enhance his own spiritual sense by descending deeper into the ravine. With that in mind, he stowed the jade slip away, then rose to his feet and recommenced his descent. However, it didn't take long before Han Li's brows began to furrow slightly, and as he continued his descent, the concern on his face only grew more pronounced. Contrary to his expectations, the yin winds deeper in the ravine had only become weaker instead of stronger. Even though the baleful qi was only becoming denser the deeper he went, without those yin winds to complement it, the baleful qi alone wasn't sufficient to conjure up those illusions in his mind. A disappointed look appeared on Han Li's face, and after a brief pause, he returned to the depth where the yin wind was strongest before sitting down with his legs crossed to try and cultivate the fifth level of the spirit refinement technique. Half a year flew by in a flash. As Han Li opened his eyes, a rather frustrated look appeared on his face. During the past 6 months, he had been cultivating constantly without rest, but progress had been extremely slow. Not only was progress far slower than when he was able to take advantage of those baleful qi illusions to cultivate the spirit refinement technique, it was significantly slower than even under normal circumstances. Han Li took a deep breath to compose himself. Back when he was cultivating the third level of the spirit refinement technique, he had encountered the same problem, but eventually, he was able to master the third level with enough time. However, in this situation, he simply didn't have time to make slow and steady progress. After some contemplation, he made a hand seal, and his body shuddered slightly, following which all of the surrounding baleful qi abruptly converged toward him, inundating him in the blink of an eye. All of a sudden, he felt as if he could hear the blood-curdling howls of countless demon beasts ringing out beside his ears, and at the same time, bursts of sinister and violent intent began infiltrating all parts of his body. He took a deep breath and didn't channel any of his cultivation arts to defend himself. Bursts of dense, baleful chi surged erratically throughout his body, and it felt as if there were countless tiny daggers twisting in his meridians. His brows furrowed slightly, but then quickly unfurrowed again, and he promptly devoured a cultivation enhancement pill before channeling his profound, baleful spirit arts. All of the baleful chi that had accumulated in his body instantly erupted forth, manifesting itself as a vast expanse of black light that resembled a cloud of dense mist. The black light instantly fused as one with the surrounding baleful chi, stirring up the nearby baleful chi into a frenzy, causing them to form a series of vortexes around him, before surging into his body at an even faster rate than before. All of a sudden, Han Li was completely inundated by a dense black cloud, and he felt as if there were countless needles piercing into his skin. As he continued to channel the profound, baleful spirit arts, the bursts of erratic, baleful chi in his body began to converge toward a single point, forming a vast wave of baleful chi. He couldn't help but give a muffled groan, and his brows became tightly furrowed with agony. Earlier, the bursts of baleful chi had been spread out all over his body, and they had caused him some pain, but it wasn't all that severe. However, now that all of the baleful chi had converged to one place, the pain was far more unbearable than before. Thankfully, there didn't seem to be any other detrimental effects aside from the excruciating pain for now, and Han Li was able to grit his teeth and persevere as he directed the baleful chi toward his 60-second immortal acupoint. He was well aware of the fact that because this was extraneous baleful chi that he hadn't accumulated in his body, he would instinctively reject it. On top of that, this extraneous baleful chi was only going to be even more ferocious and untamed than the baleful chi that was already in his body. Similarly, the sinister and violent intent imbued in this baleful chi was only going to be even more ferocious, and if he wasn't careful, it could easily overwhelm his immortal acupoints and completely destroy his consciousness. However, time was of the essence here, and extreme measures had to be taken, so despite the severe degree of risk involved, he was still planning to use this extraneous baleful chi to help him open up his immortal acupoints. It's still not enough. Han Li spat through gritted teeth with tightly furrowed brows. He made a rapid string of hand seals, and the black light around him brightened significantly, while the rate of influx of baleful chi sped up by twofold. But at the same time, the pain also became twice as unbearable. Han Li forcibly suppressed the excruciating pain as he continued to absorb more baleful chi into his own body, before channeling it toward his immortal acupoint. The baleful chi within the ravine began to churn violently, causing the demon beast carcasses on the cliff faces on either side of the ravine to tumble down before shattering into powdered bone and specks of fluorescent flames in midair. As time slowly passed, the baleful chi in the surrounding area began to thin out, while the baleful chi directly around Han Li became denser and denser. Over 3 months passed by in a flash. On this day, a resounding boom suddenly rang out within the ravine. Deep within the ravine, Han Li was hovering in midair, and a small vortex was taking shape on his back beneath his shoulder blades. The vortex was voraciously absorbing the world's origin chi that was surging down from above the ravine, and only after close to 20 seconds had passed did the influx of the world's origin chi slowly subside. At this point, the vortex had been replaced by a speck of golden light, and it was none other than Han Li's 60-second immortal acupoint. Han Li took a moment to inspect the immortal acupoint, and he discovered that aside from the vast amount of immortal spiritual power within it, there was a large quantity of baleful chi as well, far more than what was present in his previous immortal acupoints. It was clear that opening acupoints using extraneous baleful qi was different from doing so using one's innate baleful qi. Hanli shook his head and set aside his concerns for now, then summoned his mantra-treasured axis, upon which he discovered that 2 more time Dao runes had appeared on its surface. He then gently exhaled before casting his gaze down into the dark ravine below. Due to the fact that the baleful qi at this altitude had virtually been completely absorbed by Han Li, the baleful qi down below was quickly rising up to fill the void left behind. Despite this, Han Li was still unable to see the bottom of the ravine from where he was. After devouring a pill and taking some time to rest, Han Li rose to his feet, then plunged rapidly down into the depths of the ravine, instantly sinking into the boundless baleful qi down below. Just as he had anticipated, the deeper he descended, the more viscous the surrounding baleful qi became. After descending for only around 30 kilometers, he could already sense that the yin winds and baleful qi swirling around him had become several times more powerful than before, and all types of horrific illusions began to surface in his mind again. However, with his current spiritual sense, he had become significantly more impervious to these illusions, and he continued descending without pause. After descending for close to another 20 kilometers, the surrounding yin winds subsided somewhat once again, but the baleful qi in the area had become even denser, to the point that Han Li felt as if he were encountering physical resistance in his descent. Right at this moment, numerous specks of green light suddenly appeared directly in front of him, and they quickly converged to form the same giant green rat from before. However, this time, it was several times more massive than before, and its body was so severely charred and ravaged that it looked as if hot oil had been poured all over it. The skin and fur on its face had been completely stripped away, and its 2 massive eyeballs looked as if they could fall out of its eye sockets at any moment. A sharp screeching sound rang out as the giant rat came charging directly at Han Li, bringing along with it an indescribable odor of blood and gore, an odor so intense that Han Li felt as if there were a boundless wave of blood crashing toward him. However, Han Li was already mentally prepared, and he remained completely unfazed as he channeled his spirit refinement technique while letting loose a thunderous roar. A burst of tremendous spiritual sense instantly swept through his consciousness, cleansing his mind like a storm on a hot summer's day. The giant rat illusion was instantly dispelled before it could reach Han Li, and he took only a brief moment to compose himself before continuing his descent. He knew that the purer and denser the baleful qi he had access to, the quicker he would be able to open his immortal acupoints and elevate his own cultivation base. Time was quickly ticking down, and he had to make the most of every single moment. The more power that he could attain, the greater his chances of surviving this ordeal. However, he was forced to draw to a halt after descending for only several thousand more feet. This time, what had stopped him wasn't an illusion. Instead, it was the baleful qi, which had become dense to the extreme. The baleful qi that was currently beneath him wasn't even present in the form of mist anymore. Instead, it resembled an unmoving black wall that was formed by solidified ink. Han Li could clearly sense that the baleful qi within this wall was different from the baleful qi that was currently swirling around him, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was different. After a brief moment of hesitation, he leaned down before attempting to plunge one of his hands into the wall. However, as soon as he reached into the wall of baleful qi, his wrist and hand were instantly struck by a burst of sharp, bone-chilling pain as the surrounding baleful qi morphed themselves into sharp needles as if they were living creatures, then pierced themselves into his skin. Han Li shuddered as he hurriedly attempted to withdraw his hand, only to discover that he was unable to do so as his hand had somehow been locked into place. He immediately activated his bright sight spirit eyes, upon which he discovered that those needles of baleful qi were anchoring his hand firmly into place, rendering it completely immobilized. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly as a bolt of golden lightning shot out of the palm of his hand, and the intrusive needles of baleful qi immediately sprang back in the face of his divine devil-bane lightning. But they were still circling around his hand like a pack of predators stalking their prey. Han Li took advantage of this opportunity to pull back his hand, and his pupils immediately contracted slightly in response to what he saw. At this moment, the palm of his hand was riddled with countless tiny red spots, all of which were tiny holes as thin as strands of hair. As it turned out, the needles of baleful qi had pierced all the way through his hand, and there were wisps of black qi permeating throughout these tiny holes. Another burst of divine devil-bane lightning erupted out of his hand, and the residual wisps of baleful qi were instantly eradicated, while the tiny holes on his hand also quickly healed, but there was still a hint of lingering fear in Han Li's eyes. If he hadn't reacted as quickly as he did, then this hand would have been completely destroyed. It seemed that the deeper he went, the more aggressive the baleful qi became, and at this point, the baleful qi was actively invading his body without requiring any guidance. With that in mind, it most likely wasn't going to be a simple task to control the baleful qi here and guide it toward his immortal acupoints. A hesitant look appeared on Han Li's face as he stared at the black wall down below. If he were to allow the baleful qi within the black wall to infiltrate his body, then he would be taking a huge risk, and he could easily fall to his demise. However, if he could control the baleful qi here, then he would undoubtedly be able to make rapid progress in opening further immortal acupoints. After grappling with this dilemma for some time, Han Li finally made up his mind. At this point, there really was no turning back. He had already chosen to place all of his eggs in one basket, so he could only continue down the path of no return. With his mind made up, Han Li plunged straight into the black wall without any further hesitation. As soon as he entered the black wall, he immediately felt as if an enormous weight had crashed down onto his consciousness. A sharp screeching sound was reverberating incessantly in his mind, and he felt as if he had been robbed of all of his senses. His entire body was enveloped in viscous baleful qi, which formed countless sharp needles that pierced through his skin and flesh, all the way until they reached his bones. The physical and spiritual pain from the experience was so immense that Han Li immediately began to tremble uncontrollably, and his consciousness was on the verge of fading away. He gritted his teeth with all his mind, and with his final shred of lucidity, he began to channel his spirit refinement technique. As soon as he did this, he immediately felt as if a gust of wind were sweeping through his consciousness, instantly silencing the sharp ringing sound while also restoring his spiritual sense to its normal state. With his spiritual sense recovered, he was able to protect his own mind while simultaneously channeling the profound baleful spirit arts, guiding the immense baleful qi in his body toward his 63rd immortal acupoint. However, to his alarm and horror, only a part of the baleful qi in his body was successfully guided toward his immortal acupoint, while the rest continued to surge toward all parts of his body in a completely unrestrained fashion. A string of loud cracks and pops instantly rang out from within Han Li's body, and a series of massive bulges began to appear beneath his skin. As a result, his body began to inflate rapidly like a balloon, and it looked as if he were about to explode at any moment. Despite his alarm, Han Li was able to remain composed, and he began to make a rapid string of hand seals in an attempt to control the baleful qi that was continuing to surge into his body. But at this moment, his body was like a broken dam that was impossible to seal. His body continued to swell further and further, but at the same time, a small vortex had appeared on his shoulder, and it was absorbing a portion of the incoming baleful qi. That vortex was actually another one of Han Li's immortal acupoints. Due to the excessive influx of baleful qi, that immortal acupoint had opened up on its own, and it was absorbing baleful qi as quickly as it could alongside Han Li's 63rd immortal acupoint. Han Li gritted his teeth tightly as he persevered through the excruciating pain. At the same time, he was channeling his profound baleful spirit arts with all his might, trying to guide as much of the baleful qi in his body toward the two immortal acupoints as possible. Ali. Over 10 years flew by in a flash. Jin Tong was seated with her legs crossed on the cliff at the entrance of the ravine, and in a rare display of discipline, she was cultivating through seated meditation. Xiao Bai was laying on the ground not far away from her, with its front paws resting beneath its chin, and it seemed to have fallen asleep. Right at this moment, a burst of golden light descended from above before landing on the cliff. Xiao Bai took a glance to discover that it was Taoist Zai, who had returned from examining the formation, then closed its eyes again. Meanwhile, Jin Tong's eyes remained closed the entire time. Right at this moment, a burst of rumbling akin to resounding thunderclaps rang out from deep within the ravine, immediately following which a cloud of baleful qi rose up from down below, all the way until it spilled over the edge of the cliff. Only then did Jin Tong's eyes spring open, and she jumped to her feet, then rushed over to the edge of the cliff before peering down into the ravine with an anxious expression. Xiao Bai had also gotten up from the ground, and it jogged over to her side before casting its gaze into the ravine as well. "Uncle," Jin Tong murmured to herself with a complex look on her face, one that was a combination of anticipation, concern, excitement, and unease. A resounding boom rang out as the sky above the ravine shuddered, and wisps of the world's origin qi that were visible to the naked eye converged from all directions, forming an enormous funnel in the sky, directing a vast quantity of the world's origin qi into the ravine. In the valley not far away from the ravine, a giant human face appeared on a huge tree, then cast its gaze toward the ravine. The root system beneath it also began to rustle violently as the entire tree moved toward the ravine. The ground within the valley split open as the trees on either side moved back to clear a wide path, allowing the giant tree demon free passage. There was a perplexed look on the tree demon's faces as it rushed through the valley, but it suddenly stopped cold in its tracks as it discovered that the vast funnel of the world's origin qi was hovering directly above the ravine that was filled with baleful qi. A wary look appeared on its face upon seeing this, and after a brief hesitation, it suddenly turned around before rushing back into the valley. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers deep in the ravine, Han Li was standing in midair, glowing as brightly as the sun, and the golden light radiating from his body was keeping all of the surrounding baleful qi over 100 feet away from him. The radiant golden light formed countless threads that intertwined with one another to create a golden cocoon that enveloped his entire body, and only a faint silhouette was visible through it. The vast world's origin qi that had been funneled into the area came cascading down like an enormous golden waterfall, forming a massive rippling vortex around the golden cocoon. No light had reached this point in the ravine for countless years, yet the entire area was suddenly illuminated by the radiant golden light, and even though it was unable to completely shine through the dense baleful qi, it was still a stunning sight to behold. The golden waterfall continued to cascade down for 3 whole days before finally fatting, following which a roar of exaltation suddenly rang out from within the ravine. A burst of scorching golden light rose up within the giant golden cocoon, and it swept through the cocoon like a sword to slice it into two. Han Li flew out of the cocoon with golden light flashing in his eyes, then opened his mouth to release a burst of tremendous suction force, drawing all of the golden light in the ravine into his belly, and the golden cocoon also disintegrated into specks of golden light before surging into his mouth. At the same time, a speck of golden light appeared on his back, and it was flashing incessantly while absorbing the residual world's origin chi in the air. With that, his 84th immortal acupoint had finally been opened. Just like his previous immortal acupoints, this one also had some hints of black baleful chi within it, and it was actually even more apparent in this particular immortal acupoint. Hanli swept a hand through the air with a calm expression, and his mantra-treasured axis appeared in front of him amid a flash of golden light, then began to revolve on the spot while releasing waves of golden ripples. At this point, there were over 400 time Tao runes on the axis, and all of them lit up in unison. At the same time, there were also now as many as 18 time law threads wrapped around the mantra-treasured axis. Hanli raised a hand to make a beckoning motion, and the 18 time law threads immediately turned as straight as arrows before flying toward him, only to curl around his fingers upon reaching him. Sensing the energy fluctuations emanating from the time law threads, Hanli murmured to himself, "I didn't think that I would attain so many additional time law threads by mastering the 4th level of the mantra axis scripture. Now that the mantra-treasured axis has become even more powerful, I'll stand a better chance against the gold-devouring immortal." As soon as his voice trailed off, he swept a sleeve through the air to stow the mantra-treasured axis away again. As all of the golden light around him faded, the surrounding baleful chi converged once again to inundate him. Hanli had absorbed much of the baleful chi in this area, so it wasn't as dense as it had originally been, but down below was still a vast expanse of impenetrable darkness, and it seemed that the density of the baleful chi deeper in the ravine hadn't changed at all. Hanli took a deep breath, then sat down with his legs crossed and swallowed a cultivation base consolidation pill before closing his eyes to meditate. Ali. 3 days and 3 nights later, Hanli reopened his eyes, then rose to his feet. There's not much time left until the 20 years are up, so it's about time that I discuss some strategy with Brother Zai and the others. With that in mind, Hanli cast his gaze upward, yet right as he was about to ascend out of the ravine, a familiar voice suddenly rang out in his mind. "Fellow Taoist Han, we've already made it to this point. Don't you want to go to the bottom of the ravine to see what's down there?" Hanli's expression changed slightly upon hearing this, following which he asked with furrowed brows, "Didn't I already cut off your perception of the outside world? How do you know where I am right now?" "Please don't misunderstand, fellow Taoist Han. I'm not to blame for this. It's just that the sudden drastic increase of the baleful chi in your body has strengthened my connection to the outside world slightly," Mo Guang hurriedly explained. "Aren't you a heavenly devilish monarch? I never knew that you could make use of baleful chi," Hanli mused as he raised an eyebrow. "Baleful chi is not something that only humans and demon beasts possess. Instead, it arises within all living beings who have taken the lives of others. On top of that, our heavenly devils are even more sensitive to these types of negative energies than humans," Mo Guang explained. While conversing with Mo Guang, Hanli covertly examined the connection between himself and Mo Guang, and he was relieved to find that there was indeed nothing amiss. "Why have you suddenly proposed for me to go to the bottom of the ravine, fellow Taoist Mo Guang? Have you discovered something?" "Not exactly. I only have a vague feeling that there seems to be something very special down there. This is only a suggestion from me. If you feel like it's not worth the trip, then don't worry about it," Mo Guang replied. After a brief silence, Hanli decided, "It can't hurt to go down and have a look." With that, he continued to descend deeper into the ravine. After descending for several hundred kilometers, the surrounding baleful chi had become so dense that even Hanli was feeling rather uncomfortable, despite his current cultivation base and spiritual sense. by drawing upon the baleful chi in the ravine to open up his immortal acupoints for such an extended period of time. Both his body and soul had undergone some slight changes, allowing him to gradually integrate himself into this environment. However, the 20-year time limit was fast approaching, and there wasn't enough time left to make any further significant progress. So he had decided that he was immediately going to turn back if the baleful chi were to become too dense to bear. However, right at this moment, an enormous green skeleton suddenly appeared in his field of view. The skeleton was long and sleek, with a spine that resembled a winding ridge. On either side of the spine were racks of ribs, beneath which the bones of the creature's 4 limbs were still intact. On top of that, the limbs were all standing straight, supporting the skeleton in an upright position, as if it had died standing and remained that way, even in death. Hanli flew down until he landed beside the skeleton, and by his estimates, he was currently at least 1,000 kilometers away from the entrance of the ravine up above. He walked around the mountainous skeleton until he was standing directly in front of it, and he discovered that the skull of the skeleton was resting on the ground, while bursts of baleful chi were rising up incessantly out of its massive eye sockets before spreading into the surrounding space. The head was quite wide up top, but then tapered to a point, and there was a pair of massive front teeth protruding out of front of its long mouth, giving it the appearance of a massive rat. Hanli immediately recalled the giant green rat that he had seen in the baleful chi illusions earlier, and it occurred to him that this seemed to be the rat's carcass. At the very center of the giant rat's glabella was a hole with smooth and even edges that pierced all the way through the back of its head, and it seemed that had been the killing blow. The skeleton was already completely devoid of spiritual power fluctuations, but as Hanli stood in its presence, he was still struck by a sense of insignificance and inferiority, as if he were standing before a vast mountain. What was particularly noteworthy about the giant rat were its 2 front teeth, which were of a slightly darker green color than the rest of its body, and there were bursts of clear law power fluctuations emanating from them. Hanli was rather curious to see this, and he was just about to take a closer look when he suddenly noticed that the body of a purple-robed man was laying behind the giant rat's head. A hint of surprise appeared on Hanli's face upon seeing this. The body of the man was largely quite well preserved, but it was looking extremely wizened, and its skin was a purplish-green color. On top of that, its clothes were in complete tatters, and there was a layer of black dust-like granular substance all over the entire body. Hanli skirted around the giant rat's head to approach the body, and he was immediately struck by a wave of incredibly fierce baleful chi, causing him to stop in his tracks as his brows became tightly furrowed. He cast his gaze toward the body's face to find that its features didn't actually appear very old, and it was only due to its severely sunken cheeks and eyes that it had initially appeared like a wizened elderly man. Within its sunken eye sockets, the body's eyes were still open, and what was particularly harrowing was that its pupils were a completely dull and lifeless gray color. This is a gray immortal. No wonder I felt a slightly familiar aura just now. Just like Mo Yu from the Infernal Frost Immortal Manor, this purple-robed body had also belonged to a gray immortal. His gaze roamed back and forth between the 2 bodies, following which he turned his attention to the baleful chi in the surrounding area, and he immediately realized that these 2 bodies were the source of the terrifying baleful chi in the ravine. Hanli didn't get too close, keeping his distance as he made a lap around the gray immortal's body, and he didn't spot many injuries on the body. In fact, the only one he could see was an uneven wound on its right temple, and that wound seemed to have been somewhat corroded as there was a dark green coloration on its jagged edges. Judging from what he could see, it appeared that the giant rat and this gray immortal had fought in a battle countless years ago, ultimately leading to their mutual demise. Perhaps this enormous ravine had been created during the course of their battle. Han Li withdrew his gaze from the gray Immortal as he returned his attention to the giant rat carcass, and a contemplative look appeared on his face. Even though it's already been dead for countless years, its body is still giving off such formidable spiritual power fluctuations. If I can get Jin Tong to devour it, perhaps she'll be able to advance further in her cultivation base. With that in mind, Han Li cast his gaze toward the rat's two massive front teeth, then raised a hand, and an azure bamboo cloud swarm sword appeared in his grasp. He injected his immortal spiritual power into the sword before lashing out at the base of the pair of front teeth, and a sharp clang rang out as a burst of dark green light erupted out of the base of the teeth. A wave of formidable sword chi surged through the air alongside the eruption of dark green light, and a burst of intensely corrosive energy fluctuations surged forth from within the teeth. A burst of azure light rose up around Han Li's body, and only then was he able to keep this corrosive aura at bay. Close to 20 seconds later, the corrosive aura fluctuations gradually subsided, and an elated look had appeared on Han Li's face. Even though he hadn't gone all out in that attack just now, it was still quite extraordinary that the rat's teeth had managed to remain completely unscathed. After a brief pause, Han Li summoned 3 azure bamboo cloud swarm swords at once, then combined the 3 into a single sword. Arcs of electricity surged over the sword alongside bursts of formidable sword chi as he lashed out once again at the base of the teeth, and only then did the pair of teeth fall out of the giant rat's mouth. Han Li gently exhaled as he stowed the swords and the pair of front teeth away, then made his way over to the body of the gray Immortal to conduct a closer inspection. The purple robe on the body appeared to be made from quite an exceptional material, but unfortunately it was already ruined. Han Li swept a sleeve through the air, releasing a burst of azure light to flip the body over, and a gray cloth pouch fell out. An elated look appeared in Han Li's eyes as he hurriedly picked up the cloth pouch before injecting his spiritual sense into it, and sure enough, it was a storage pouch. He emptied the contents of the storage pouch onto the ground, and to his slight dismay, it only amounted to an unexpectedly small pile of items, most of which were materials that were either gray or black in color. Han Li swept his gaze over the pile of items, and several fist-sized black crystals suddenly caught his interest. The crystals were giving off a faint black glow that seemed to be capable of devouring all of the surrounding light, and they were also releasing formidable law power fluctuations. These were none other than black marrow crystal, the primary ingredient for refining origin void pills. Furthermore, these black marrow crystals were clearly of a far superior quality to the ones that Worm 3 had given him. Han Li swept a sleeve through the air, releasing a burst of azure light that picked up one of the black marrow crystals for a closer inspection, then stowed all of the black marrow crystals away. Outside of the black marrow crystals, most of the materials on the ground were unfamiliar to Han Li, but many of them were giving off powerful energy fluctuations that weren't inferior to those of the black marrow crystals. In particular, there were 3 items that were giving off energy fluctuations that set them apart from everything else. One of these items was a gray bone that was around a foot in length. It was extremely hard, and if it weren't for the gray patterns present on its surface, it would appear no different from a normal rock. It was clear that this was a very ancient artifact, but Han Li had no idea what type of creature the bone belonged to. The second item was a large black spirit flower with crimson spirit patterns on all of its flower petals, and they connected together to form the design of an unsettling smiling face. The final one of the 3 items was a vial of gray liquid. A layer of gray flames could be seen on the surface of the liquid, but it was somehow giving off an intense chill that could be felt even through the vial. The auras of these materials were completely different from those of normal spirit materials, so Han Li could only presume that these things could only be found in the gray realm. After conducting a brief inspection, he stowed all of these materials away, and the only things that remained on the ground were a pair of immortal treasures and a black jade box. One of the immortal treasures was a black spear with an antiquated shaft and a gleaming black spearhead, within which a red mark could be seen, giving off formidable killing intent. The other immortal treasure was a gray veil that was as thin as a cicada's wing, and it was etched with numerous star designs that were giving off a faint gray glow. Han Li bent down to pick up the black spear, but to his surprise, it was extraordinarily heavy, almost comparable in weight to his heavy water true axis. He mustered up some more strength to pick up the black spear, then thrust it forward thrice in rapid succession, and 3 vibrant spear projections instantly emerged before exploding one after the other, causing the nearby space to tremble violently. Han Li's eyes immediately lit up upon seeing this, and he began injecting his immortal spiritual power into the spear. But the influx of immortal spiritual power didn't draw any reaction out of the spear. Han Li raised an eyebrow upon seeing this, but it then occurred to him that the energy in a gray immortal's body had to have been completely different from immortal spiritual power. So this was most likely a weapon that could only be used by a gray immortal. With that in mind, a disappointed look appeared in his eyes, and he was just about to stow the spear away when he suddenly noticed that a thin layer of black light had appeared on its surface. As it turned out, while injecting immortal spiritual power into the spear, some of the baleful chi in his immortal acupoints had also surged into it, and that had drawn a slight reaction out of the spear. Could it be that this weapon can be powered by baleful chi? With that in mind, Han Li released the pent-up baleful chi in his body, and it began to swirl around him as a cloud of black mist. He then slowly guided the baleful chi into the spear, and the black light emanating from it instantly brightened significantly. At the same time, the red mark in the spearhead also began to glow radiantly, while releasing strands of crimson light that circled around the tip of the spear incessantly. To Han Li's surprise, this weapon really could be powered using his baleful chi. However, he could tell that this was a weapon of an extremely high caliber, and that he was only able to tap into a small portion of its power. After stowing the black spear away, he picked up the gray veil, which was as soft and insubstantial as a cloud, and as light as a feather. Han Li inspected the veil briefly, then injected his baleful chi into it, and a layer of gray light instantly emerged over the veil, which had also become several times thicker than before. At the same time, a series of antiquated patterns appeared on its surface, and in contrast with normal spirit patterns, these ones seemed to be far more haphazard, but also somehow more profound. In this thicker form, the veil was still very soft and pliable, but also extremely resilient, indicating that it was an exceptional defensive material. Right at this moment, a curious look appeared in his eyes as his gaze settled upon the patterns on the veil's surface. These patterns were somewhat familiar to him, and he felt as if he had seen them before somewhere. It didn't take long before he recalled exactly where he had seen something like this before, and he immediately summoned a silver jade box, within which was a piece of soft material. This was none other than the mysterious gray cloth that he had obtained from Xingshan. He spread the gray cloth open, and there were some enigmatic patterns etched on its surface. These patterns were slightly different from the ones on the veil, but it was clear that they were of the same style. Looks like this gray cloth is also from the gray realm. With that in mind, Han Li injected his baleful chi into the cloth, but it displayed no response. Han Li raised an eyebrow upon seeing this, and he began to wonder if he was mistaken. However, he continued to persevere, injecting more and more baleful qi into the gray cloth. But even after a full 15 minutes had passed by, the cloth still wasn't displaying any reaction. Hanli grew a little disheartened upon seeing this, and he was just about to withdraw his baleful qi when a layer of faint gray light suddenly appeared over the cloth's surface, a layer of light so faint that it was barely detectable at all. Hanli's eyes immediately lit up upon seeing this, and he took a deep breath before redoubling his efforts, further increasing the outflow of baleful qi. The light emanating from the gray cloth gradually became brighter and brighter, and the antiquated patterns on its surface also slowly lit up while becoming clearer and clearer. However, even as Hanli continued to inject more baleful qi into the gray cloth beyond this point, the light emanating from it didn't become any brighter, nor did the antiquated patterns on its surface become any clearer. It looks like I don't possess sufficient baleful qi to fully reveal what's on the cloth, Hanli thought to himself, then stopped what he was doing and inspected the gray cloth for a while longer before stowing it away again. The cloth was something that Hanli had obtained by chance anyway, so it would naturally be great if he could uncover its secrets, but even if he couldn't, it wasn't going to weigh on his mind. After that, he stowed the gray veil away as well, then picked up the black jade box, which was sealed by a gray talisman. Hanli's gaze rested on the gray talisman for a moment, and he discovered that the runes on it were drastically different from normal runes, but the patterns on the gray cloth and the gray veil were rather similar. After some contemplation, he cast an incantation seal onto the talisman, and a layer of gray light instantly appeared over its surface to repel the incantation seal. Hanli raised an eyebrow as a burst of golden light that was giving off faint time-law power fluctuations emerged from his hand, yet that was also repelled upon making contact with the gray talisman. His expression remained unchanged, and this time he channeled the baleful qi in his body before attempting to make contact with the gray talisman again. This time the gray light on the talisman flashed momentarily before fading away, and it didn't reject the baleful qi. Hanli was very encouraged to see this, and he immediately began injecting baleful qi into the talisman. The seal within the talisman wasn't actually all that complex, and he was quickly able to undo it. Around 15 minutes later, the gray talisman flew off the black jade box on its own, following which the box sprang open to reveal a crimson mask inside. Hanli picked up the mask, and a surprised look appeared on his face. This was a crimson mask assigned to the reincarnation disciples of the Reincarnation Palace. It was quite similar in appearance to his dragon mask, and the words Dragon 4 were inscribed upon it. Dragon 4, could it be that this gray immortal was from the Reincarnation Palace? Hanli murmured to himself. The Reincarnation Palace mask given to him by Worm 3 bore the words Dragon 5. Hanli didn't think much of this as he stowed both the mask and the jade box away, then turned his attention back to the body of the gray immortal. Right at this moment, Mo Guang's voice suddenly rang out in his mind. Looks like we're in luck, fellow Taoist Han. This is a very well-preserved gray immortal body, and this gray immortal was most likely at the high zenith stage back when they were alive. So what? No matter how powerful they were, they're nothing but a corpse now. Why do you sound so excited, fellow Taoist Mo Guang? Hanli asked. Back when I was with Ma Liang, I came across a scripture in a set of ruins that contained some information pertaining to gray immortals. That scripture contained a secret technique that can be used to refine the body of a gray immortal into an avatar. After obtaining this scripture, Ma Liang had always wanted to find a gray immortal body, but wasn't able to do so. I certainly wasn't expecting to find one here, Mo Guang explained. Is that right? Hanli was quite intrigued to hear this. Back in the Infernal Frost Immortal Manor, he had witnessed just how powerful the high zenith stage Mo Yu was, and if he could come into possession of a high zenith stage gray immortal avatar, then he would stand a much better chance against the gold-devouring immortal. I wouldn't dare to lie to you, fellow Taoist Han. Gray immortals are different from normal cultivators in that following their demise, the energy in their bodies won't quickly dissipate. Instead, most of it remains in their body, thereby making it possible to refine their bodies into avatars. You're truly in luck, fellow Taoist Han. If you can successfully refine this body into an avatar, then you'll be able to use it against that gold-devouring immortal, Mo Guang said. Show me the refinement method, Han Li requested. Mo Guang immediately emerged from the shadow beneath his feet, following which Han Li handed a white jade slip to him, and Mo Guang accepted the jade slip, then made a copy of the refinement method before handing it back to Han Li. After briefly inspecting the refinement method in the jade slip, Han Li's brows began to furrow slightly. The refinement method was quite different from normal avatar refinement methods, and many prerequisites had to be satisfied, one of which was that the user had to possess tremendous baleful qi. During the refinement process, the user had to inject their baleful qi into several important points in the gray immortal's body in order to be able to control it. Secondly, the user had to split their own soul using a special secret technique, then use another secret technique to fuse their baleful qi and a split portion of their soul, converting it into a baleful soul that could possess the gray immortal's body. Only with both conditions met could one ensure complete control over the avatar. The first condition is easy to meet, but the second condition, the one that requires splitting one's soul before creating a baleful soul, is that detrimental to the user in any way? Han Li asked. There will inevitably be some detrimental effects that arise from splitting one's soul, and following the conversion into a baleful soul, it'll regularly transmit negative emotions of violence and bloodlust into the user's mind. However, that's only to be expected. The energy in a gray immortal's body is directly contrary to that of a cultivator, so the two will conflict with each other. If a normal soul were to enter a gray immortal's body, it would quickly be destroyed. Only after a conversion into a baleful soul would it be able to reside long-term in a gray immortal's body, Mo Guang replied. The excitement in Han Li's heart slowly faded upon hearing this. If he could refine this gray immortal body into an avatar at only a minor cost, then he would be happy to pursue this option. But not only was this soul-splitting technique going to be very harmful to his soul, it would also affect him on an emotional level, and those consequences were simply unacceptably severe. If you feel like the detrimental effects are too much, there's actually another solution, Mo Guang suddenly said. What is it? Han Li asked. It's very simple. You can allow me to enter the gray immortal's body in the place of your split soul, Mo Guang replied. Han Li was very surprised to hear this. I am a heavenly devilish monarch, Mo Guang continued. I possess no form or substance, which makes me very similar to a soul. On top of that, I possess a very high level of natural resistance to the energy in the bodies of gray immortals, so I should be able to enter the body just fine. Han Li was silent for a moment upon hearing this, then asked, Fellow Taoist Mo Guang, how long has it been since we signed our contract back in the spirit realm? I'm always in a state of slumber, so I don't have much of a concept of the passage of time, but it should have been at least 10,000 years by now. Why do you ask, fellow Taoist Han? Mo Guang asked. Given how many years we've been together, I'm sure you're very familiar with my personality, and I'm sure you would have known that I wouldn't have agreed to using the soul-splitting technique. From the very beginning, your plan was to possess this body yourself, right? Han Li asked. Mo Guang's expression stiffened slightly upon hearing this, following which a wry smile appeared on his face as he sighed. Looks like I can't hide anything from you. My intention was indeed to possess this gray, immortal body myself, but I don't harbor any ill will toward you. All I want is to be able to help you in the upcoming battle against the gold-devouring Immortal. If you're killed by the gold-devouring Immortal, I'll also be in a terrible situation." "That's the extent of your intentions?" Hanli asked as he raised an eyebrow. "Of course, I also want to attain more power for myself. You've already reached the late golden immortal stage, while Jin Tong and Taoist Zai have both reached the golden immortal stage as well, leaving me as the only one still stuck at the true immortal stage, and it's not a good feeling to be left behind like this." Mo Guang sighed with a hint of dejection on his face. Hanli remained silent as he stared at Mo Guang with a contemplative look in his eyes. Moments later, he suddenly raised a hand to release a burst of azure light that enveloped the gray immortal's body. Strands of translucent azure light emerged before wrapping themselves around the body, quickly forming a cocoon around it. As a result, the immense baleful qi being released by the body was sealed in and unable to spread through the surrounding area. "We'll discuss this matter some other time," Hanli said as he stowed the cocoon away. Mo Guang nodded in response, then vanished into Hanli's shadow again. After that, Hanli returned to the giant rat carcass with slightly furrowed brows. The giant rat carcass contained immense spiritual power, but as one of the sources of baleful qi in this place, it also contained tremendous baleful qi, so it was definitely inedible to Jin Tong and Zio Bai. However, there was a solution to this. After some contemplation, Hanli swept a sleeve through the air to summon a stack of formation plates and formation flags, then set them up near the rat carcass. A day and a night later, a gourd-shaped formation had taken shape around the carcass, and within the formation were 4 black rings the size of round tables. The lines in the formation were particularly concentrated near these rings, indicating that they were the 4 most important points in the formation. Hanli began to chant an incantation while making a hand seal, and specks of black spiritual light emerged all over the gourd-shaped formation. In particular, 4 pillars of black light had erupted out of the 4 rings, and they were swaying back and forth like the tentacles of a living creature. All of a sudden, Hanli switched to a different hand seal, and the 4 pillars of black light instantly shot into the giant rat's carcass in unison. The immense baleful qi surging out of the carcass instantly subsided, following which countless black runes abruptly appeared within it. Immediately thereafter, a dull thump rang out, and the baleful qi flowing out of the giant rat carcass became even denser, and the rate of outflow had also sped up by severalfold. Countless waves of incredibly dense baleful qi were spreading through the surrounding area, plunging the bottom of the ravine into complete darkness, and Hanli was quite pleased to see this. This formation was something that he had created on the spot using several other different formations as a foundation, and he wasn't sure if it was going to work, but thankfully, it was working exactly as planned. Hanli began to make a rapid string of hand seals to operate the formation, but right at this moment, the giant rat carcass abruptly shuddered, following which a string of loud cracks began to ring out. At the same time, 2 specks of green light emerged within its eye sockets, and they resembled a pair of eyes that were directed at Hanli. Hanli immediately felt as if he had been plunged into a glacial pit at the sight of its scrutiny, and his back instantly became drenched in cold sweat. If the giant rat carcass had somehow sprung back to life, then he was in an enormous amount of danger. With that in mind, he hurriedly sprang back in retreat as a streak of azure light. Almost at the exact same moment, the giant rat carcass opened its mouth to release a green shadow that hurtled directly toward Hanli. The green shadow was moving far faster than Hanli, and it reached him in the blink of an eye before attempting to pierce into his body. Right at this moment, countless arcs of bright golden lightning suddenly emerged over Hanli's body amid a rumbling thunderclap, and they rapidly converged to form a single thick bolt of light to oppose the green shadow. A resounding boom rang out as the bolt of golden lightning exploded violently upon making contact with the green shadow. The entire surrounding area was instantly illuminated a bright golden color, while the nearby space shuddered violently. The green shadow that had shot out of the rat carcass's mouth was also sent flying back by over 100 feet. However, it remained completely unscathed, and after steadying itself, it launched itself at Han Li once again, this time even faster than before. Han Li immediately let loose a loud roar as he summoned his mantra-treasured axis, which began releasing countless waves of golden ripples around him. Everything in the surrounding area instantly fell still, including the churning baleful qi and the trembling space, and at this point, the green shadow was only about 10 feet away from Han Li. A faint sheen of cold sweat had appeared on his head, and he heaved a faint sigh of relief. The green shadow was extraordinarily fast, and if it weren't for his lightning-fast reactions and his time-law powers, it would have definitely already pierced into his body. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, then began to inspect the green shadow with a hint of intrigue in his eyes. Right at this moment, the green shadow suddenly trembled slightly, then released a burst of bright green light that stained the surrounding golden ripples green as well. Han Li was very alarmed to see this, yet before he had a chance to do anything, a burst of formidable law powers suddenly erupted out of the green shadow. A green line then shot out of the green shadow, hurtling directly toward Han Li at a terrifying speed, and it was slicing straight through the golden ripples in its path. However, slicing through the golden ripple was clearly very arduous for the green line, as evidenced by the fact that the light emanating from it was rapidly dimming, but in the end, it was still able to reach Han Li. All of a sudden, the green shadow trembled once again before abruptly becoming extremely thin, resembling a sheet of green paper, and it also flew toward Han Li behind the green line, covering a distance of around 10 feet in the blink of an eye. Before Han Li had a chance to react, the green shadow had already vanished into his body, immediately following which it transformed into a burst of tremendous baleful qi that spread rapidly throughout his entire body. As the baleful qi flowed through Han Li's body, all of his meridians instantly became numb and as cold as ice, rendering him completely immobilized and unable to muster up any immortal spiritual power. The golden light radiating from his body rapidly faded away, as did the surrounding golden ripples, and he found himself completely enveloped within a layer of faint green light. All of this had taken place in the blink of an eye, giving him no time to react. His heart immediately sank, but he remained calm as his mind began racing to find a way out of this predicament. Right at this moment, a burst of sinister cackling suddenly rang out within his mind, and a glowing green rat suddenly appeared in his consciousness, then immediately pounced at his nascent soul. The golden nascent soul's eyes sprang open, and a furious look appeared on its face as it rubbed its hands together before thrusting them forward, instantly releasing a translucent sword projection to strike the green rat. Even though Han Li's immortal spiritual power had become completely stagnant, his spiritual sense remained uninhibited, and the green rat was instantly sliced into two. However, the green rat was completely unfazed, and it wasn't even slowed down in the slightest as it continued to pounce at Han Li's nascent soul, this time as two balls of green light. The nascent soul's brows furrowed tightly upon seeing this, and it raised its hands again to release a pair of translucent chains, which ensnared the two balls of green light in the blink of an eye, but didn't constrict any further for fear of splitting the green rat's body up into additional segments. The two balls of green light immediately began to struggle frantically within the translucent chains, and even though they weren't very bright, they were imbued with immense spiritual power. As they struggled, the pair of chains around them began trembling incessantly, and they were displaying signs of loosening. The nascent soul made a hand seal, and the two chains instantly intertwined with each other. At the same time, several more translucent chains emerged before also quickly intertwining with one another. A cage of chains quickly took shape, and it was none other than Han Li's spiritual sense cage, which had trapped both of the balls of green light inside. The two balls of green light fused as one to form a single green rat again, and there was an alarmed and furious look on its face as it struggled against the spiritual sense cage with all its might while also tearing viciously at it with its teeth. The spiritual sense cage was trembling incessantly, but it was able to hold firm. However, before Han Li even had a chance to catch his breath, the immense baleful qi that had been brought into his body by the green shadow suddenly became extremely erratic. With the green rat trapped in the spiritual sense cage, there was no one to control the baleful qi, and it had erupted into a chaotic frenzy. Han Li was still unable to channel his immortal spiritual power, but the baleful qi in his body had emerged on its own upon sensing the extraneous baleful qi. As a result, a cloud of dense black mist appeared over his entire body. The baleful qi released by the green shadow immediately fused into the black mist surrounding Han Li, and the cloud of mist began to swell drastically in size, as if it were receiving tremendous sustenance. At the same time, Han Li's profound baleful spirit arts was activated on its own, and it was rapidly absorbing the extraneous baleful qi. All of a sudden, a horrified look appeared on the face of the green rat that was trapped in the spiritual sense cage, and it began to screech frantically in a state of panic. The green light emanating from its body was flashing erratically, and with the absorption of this extraneous baleful qi, the rat's body began to shrink at a very slow rate, much like a deflating balloon. Han Li faltered slightly upon seeing this, but a thought then suddenly seemed to have occurred to him, and a complex look flashed through his eyes. Inside his spiritual sense, his nascent soul continued to focus on keeping the green rat contained in the spiritual sense cage. As the profound baleful spirit arts continued to operate, the surrounding baleful qi also began to churn violently before flooding into Han Li's body. Furthermore, the immense baleful qi emanating from the giant rat carcass had formed a thick pillar of baleful qi, which was also surging incessantly into his body. All of a sudden, Han Li was experiencing a completely unprecedented rate of baleful qi influx. As the vast volumes of baleful qi surged into his body, it formed an enormous wave that crashed toward his closed immortal acupoints. Han Li was astonished by what he was seeing, but at this moment he was still completely immobilized, so he could only look on helplessly as the situation continued to unfold. The immortal acupoints in his body were quickly beginning to loosen in the face of this overpowering wave of baleful qi, and they were forced open one after another. Within mere moments, 3 of his immortal acupoints had been opened in rapid succession. Han Li was ecstatic to see this, but his elation quickly turned to concern as his face suddenly turned a dark crimson color. With his immortal acupoints being opened so forcefully and aggressively, his meridians were trembling violently, and the resulting pain was countless times more severe than when he had previously been channeling baleful toward his immortal acupoints. However, there was nothing that he could do aside from grit his teeth and fight back the pain. As time passed, Han Li's profound baleful spirit arts began to operate in overdrive, and all of the baleful qi released by the green shadow was quickly integrated into his own baleful qi. At this point, the green rat in the spiritual sense cage had shrunk down to nothing more than a tiny speck, and with one final screech of despair, it disintegrated into nothingness. Han Li was quite relieved to see this, and he withdrew his spiritual sense cage. With all of the extraneous baleful qi absorbed, he was able to regain control over his own body. But the profound, baleful spirit arts were still completely out of his control, continuing to rapidly channel the surrounding baleful chi toward his immortal acupoints. Two dull thumps rang out in rapid succession, as two more immortal acupoints were opened. Hanli shuddered as the crimson coloration of his complexion deepened even further. A trail of blood began to trickle down from the corner of his lips, which his chest heaved violently, and his aura was becoming very erratic. He hurriedly channeled his immortal spiritual power to protect his own body and meridians, but he ultimately decided not to attempt to arrest the frenzied operation of the profound, baleful spirit arts. After what seemed like an eternity, the density of the baleful chi around Han Li had reached a terrifying level, and it looked as if there were balls of black flames dancing all over his body. His face had turned such a dark shade of crimson that it was virtually black, and blood continued to flow down from the corners of his lips, but his eyes were filled with elation. At this point, 106 immortal acupoints had already been opened in his body, yet the profound, baleful spirit arts was still operating in overdrive, frantically devouring the surrounding baleful chi. A dull thump rang out within Han Li's body as yet another immortal acupoint was opened, and he shuddered as he involuntarily threw up a mouthful of blood, but the elation in his eyes only became more pronounced. With 107 immortal acupoints opened, he had reached the pinnacle of the golden immortal stage, and just a single step further would take him to the high zenith stage. Right at this moment, all 107 of the immortal acupoints suddenly began to tremble in unison, as if they were resonating with one another, and the surrounding world's origin chi began to surge rapidly into them. Upon entering Han Li's body, the world's origin chi was converted into bursts of pure, immortal spiritual power that flowed through his meridians like a turbulent river. It seemed that the profound, baleful spirit arts had finally run its course, and it slowly ceased its operation before stopping entirely. Han Li slumped to the ground in an utterly exhausted fashion, looking as if he didn't have a single ounce of strength left in his body. After laying still for a while, he summoned a restorative pill before devouring it, then sat up straight and closed his eyes to meditate. A long while later, he opened his eyes, and the crimson coloration of his complexion had largely faded, clearly indicating that he had mostly recovered from his injuries. After taking a deep breath, he rose to his feet, and as he felt the immense immortal spiritual powers coursing through his body, he couldn't help but clench his fists in excitement. The sequence of events that had unfolded just now had been extremely perilous. It seemed that there had been a residual soul fragment left in the giant rat carcass, or perhaps the skeleton had developed its own sentient will over the course of countless years. In any case, it had attempted to use its vast baleful chi to infiltrate Han Li's spiritual sense. In the face of such an enormous influx of baleful chi, he had been completely immobilized, and even if the average high zenith cultivator had been in his place, their soul would have been destroyed long ago, forcing them to surrender their body to the green rat. It was only thanks to the combination of his profound baleful spirit arts and his tremendous spiritual sense that Han Li was just barely able to weather the storm, and he had reaped some significant rewards during the process. With 107 immortal acupoints opened, he was now only a single step away from reaching the high zenith stage. However, the obvious downside to all of this was that there was now an enormous amount of baleful chi deposited in his body, and that was rather concerning to him. After taking a moment to compose himself, Han Li turned his attention back to the giant rat carcass nearby. At this point, the baleful chi emanating from it was far sparser than before. Instead of immediately approaching the carcass, Han Li made a hand seal to reactivate the formation around it, speeding up the process of baleful chi dissipation. Close to an hour later, all of the baleful chi in the carcass had finally been expelled. At this moment, the skeleton was looking even more translucent than before, to the point that Han Li could almost see the spiritual power flowing through it. Han Li inspected his surroundings momentarily before sweeping a sleeve through the air to stow away the carcass and the formation tools around it, then began flying back up the ravine as a streak of azure light. On the stone cliff at the top of the ravine, Jin Tong was packing back and forth with an anxious expression, while occasionally peering down into the ravine. "Settle down, Jin Tong. I'm sure Master is fine," Xiao Bai said as it laid on the ground with a bored look on its face. "I can't just sit around and do nothing. There's not much time left until the 20 years run out, yet Uncle still hasn't come out yet. Something must have happened to him. I have to go down there," Jin Tong decided with a grim expression. Taoist Zai drifted over to her side to stop her, then said, "I'll go. I'm a puppet, so I'll be less affected by the baleful chi in the ravine." A grateful look appeared on Jin Tong's face upon hearing this, and she was just about to say something when she suddenly turned her gaze back to the ravine. A streak of azure light was racing up from down below, and it broke through the dense baleful chi before quickly arriving atop the cliff. The azure light faded to reveal none other than Han Li, and a displeased look immediately appeared on Jin Tong's face. But before she had a chance to complain to Han Li for his belated return, her expression suddenly changed drastically as she exclaimed, "Uncle, your cultivation base." Xiao Bai and Taoist Zai also approached Han Li, and a stunned look appeared on the former's face as it exclaimed in elation, "Master, you've reached the pinnacle of the golden immortal stage. How?" "You're certainly never one to disappoint, fellow Taoist Han," Taoist Zai praised. "Did you find some treasure down there and eat it without telling me? Is that why your cultivation base suddenly went up by so much?" Jin Tong yelled in an accusatory voice. However, she then noticed that there was something different about Han Li's physical appearance, and she asked, "Also, why have your eyes suddenly turned gray? They look so cool." Han Li's expression changed slightly upon hearing this, and he raised a hand to conjure up a mirror formed by water vapor. Sure enough, his pupils had indeed turned gray, giving him a rather similar appearance to Mo Yu. "It looks like Mo Yu wasn't telling me the full truth about the profound, baleful spirit arts, after all," Han Li thought to himself as he heaved an internal sigh. Jin Tong was a little concerned by Han Li's silence, and she hurriedly asked, "What's wrong, uncle? Did something happen?" "I'll tell you about what happened in the ravine another time. For now, come with me. I found some things that should be of help to you in the ravine," Han Li replied. "So there really is a treasure down there," Jin Tong exclaimed as her eyes lit up with excitement. "But I didn't sense anything," Xiao Bai mused with a puzzled expression. "You'll see what it is once we get there. Brother Zai, I'll have to trouble you to keep overseeing the formation up here in our absence," Han Li said as he turned to Taoist Zai. After that, he took another glance at his own reflection in the mirror that he had conjured up, only to discover that his pupils had returned to their original color. Taoist Zai nodded in response, and Han Li cupped his fist toward it in a grateful salute, then flew back down into the ravine as a streak of azure light, taking Jin Tong and Xiao Bai with him. Before long, the three of them had all vanished into the baleful chi down below. After absorbing all of the baleful chi in the giant rat carcass, Han Li had become far more sensitive to baleful chi, and his body's rejection of baleful chi had also diminished significantly. At the same time, the effect that the surrounding baleful chi had on him had become virtually negligible, and he was even able to control the baleful chi on a very rudimentary level. Upon returning to the bottom of the ravine, Han Li made his way over to the giant rat carcass, then began making a quick string of hand seals. A burst of invisible force erupted out of his body to force back the surrounding baleful qi, creating a space that was completely devoid of baleful qi. After that, he swept a sleeve through the air to release two streaks of light, one golden and one white, and they transformed into Jin Tong and Xiao Bai. As soon as she appeared, Jin Tong's brows immediately furrowed slightly as she complained, "There's so much baleful qi here." In contrast, Xiao Bai's gaze was immediately drawn to the giant rat carcass. Upon noticing the object of Xiao Bai's fixation, Jin Tong's gaze also fell upon the mountainous green skeleton, and an ecstatic look appeared on her face as she rushed toward it as a streak of golden light. However, she had only just begun flying toward the carcass when she was pulled back by Han Li. "Hold on a second. This carcass previously contained a vast amount of baleful qi. Even though the baleful qi has since been eradicated, there's still no guarantee that it won't have a detrimental effect on you, so you should conduct a careful examination before you begin eating," Han Li advised. "Don't worry about it. This amount of baleful qi isn't enough to hurt me. Let me go. I'll die if I don't eat this thing. After I'm done with it, maybe my cultivation base will go up by a lot as well," Jin Tong urged in an insistent voice as she wiped away the drool that was flowing down the corner of her lips. "Can I have some as well, master?" Xiao Bai asked with a hopeful expression. "The circumstances are a bit special right now. If eating this skeleton can help Jin Tong make a breakthrough, then we'll stand a better chance against the gold-devouring Immortal, so I'm afraid we'll have to prioritize Jin Tong for now," Han Li replied. "All right," Xiao Bai sighed in a dejected manner. "If we can survive this ordeal, I'll make sure to think of some other way to compensate you," Han Li consoled as he patted Xiao Bai on the head. Jin Tong's attention had been focused on the skeleton this entire time, and her impatience had been mounting by the second. She turned to Han Li with an eager expression as she asked, "Can I begin eating now, uncle?" Han Li could only give a resigned nod in response. Jin Tong was ecstatic, and she immediately sprang forward as a giant golden beetle, digging into the delectable feast that was laid out before her, while Xiao Bai could only watch with an envious expression. However, not long after Jin Tong began her feast, she suddenly reverted back to her human form, then flew down from the giant rat skeleton, holding a long green bone around the same thickness as a human arm in her hand. She then flew over to Han Li with a perplexed expression as she said, "Take a look at this bone, uncle. I almost chipped my tooth when I tried to eat it." Han Li accepted the bone from Jin Tong upon hearing this, then began to inspect it closely, upon which a surprised look appeared on his face. Immediately thereafter, a burst of azure light emerged over his hand as he injected a wisp of immortal spiritual power into the bone, and it immediately began to glow brightly as a rune that Han Li had never seen before appeared on its surface, giving off bursts of powerful spatial fluctuations. "This is a spatial treasure. Could this be its storage tool?" Han Li attempted to inject more of his immortal spiritual power into the bone, but all that did was make the bone glow brighter and brighter, and it became as radiant and translucent as a piece of flawless jade, but it displayed no other reaction. No matter what Han Li tried, all the bone did was glow, and Han Li was unable to refine it, nor figure out what it was meant to be used for. At this point, Jin Tong had already flown back onto the giant rat skeleton in her golden beetle form. Sometime later, a streak of golden light flew down from the skeleton, then reverted back to Jin Tong's human form, and she wiped the back of her hand over her own lips, then patted her bulging belly as she gave a content burp. "I'm full. You can have the rest, Xiao Bai," she declared in a generous manner as she pointed at what remained of the skeleton. Xiao Bai was completely caught off guard by the offer, and Jin Tong gave it a slap on the head as she urged, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up before I change my mind." Xiao Bai naturally wanted to take up the offer, but it was still a little hesitant. You're one of us, so I can't just have the entire skeleton for myself and leave nothing for you. Besides, this skeleton really is quite filling. Even at the halfway mark, I was already starting to feel a little stuffed. It's definitely going to take me a while to digest what I've eaten. On top of that, I ate quite a few of your immortal treasures while I was inside your stomach, so this makes up for that, Jin Tong said. Xiao Bai was very touched to hear this, but it still didn't immediately take Jin Tong up on her offer. Instead, it turned to Han Li for approval first. We'll do as she says, Han Li said with a nod, and Xiao Bai was certainly more than happy to oblige, swelling drastically in size before devouring the rest of the skeleton in a single bite. After that, it reverted back to its original size, while Jin Tong praised, I have to admit, your ability to swallow anything in one go is really impressive. Even I can't help but feel envious. All right, focus on digesting the skeleton now, Han Li said with a smile. Now that you mention it, I'm starting to feel a little sleepy. Jin Tong gave an involuntary yawn as she spoke, then quickly transformed into a tiny golden beetle before drifting down toward the ground. Han Li reached out to catch her, then stowed her away into a spirit beast pouch. Master, that skeleton contained an enormous amount of energy, so I'll have to go into seclusion for a while as well, Xiao Bai. Han Li nodded in response, then flipped a hand over to produce another spirit beast pouch before stowing Xiao Bai away as well. After the giant rat skeleton was gobbled up by Jin Tong and Xiao Bai, the bottom of the ravine had suddenly become a lot more spacious. Han Li swept his gaze over his surroundings, and he suddenly noticed that there were some specks of flashing green light at the foot of the cliff face that had previously been concealed by the skeleton. He approached the area, then leaned down to take a look, and he discovered that there were around a dozen semi-transparent plants growing there, each of which was around a foot in height. Their leaves were as thin and transparent as ice crystals, and the veins inside were very clearly visible and giving off faint green light. Han Li swept his spiritual sense over the strange plants briefly, but wasn't unable to detect any special aura from them. Even though he was unable to identify these plants, it was clear that they were no ordinary plants, considering they had been able to grow at the bottom of a ravine with such immense baleful qi around. However, he didn't have the time to be pondering such matters. Thus, he flipped a hand over to produce around a dozen white jade boxes, then uprooted all of the green plants before carefully placing them into the boxes, then adhered a silver talisman onto each of the boxes. After that, he remained still on the spot for a moment, seemingly in deep thought, then suddenly said, "Come out, Mo Guang." As soon as his voice trailed off, his shadow suddenly became as black as ink, then gradually elongated to around twice its original length, following which Mo Guang emerged from it. "Have you made a decision on my proposal, fellow Taoist Han?" Mo Guang asked with a smile. "I am aware of the value of a gray immortal's body. We're in the midst of a major crisis right now, so if you can maximize the body's value, then I have no reason to turn down your proposal," Han Li replied. "Rest assured, fellow Taoist, a heavenly devil contract has been signed between us, so there's a relationship of codependence between us. The more powerful I become, the more powerful you become, so ultimately it'll still be beneficial to you," Mo Guang said, as a hint of elation flashed through his eyes. "That's true. However, my understanding of gray immortals is very limited, so as a safety precaution, I'll have to plant a few restrictions in your body. Will that be acceptable?" Han Li asked. Mo Guang faltered slightly upon hearing this, then nodded in response. "Of course." Han Li wasted no further time with words as he joined his middle and index fingers before pointing them at his own glabella, releasing a burst of spiritual sense that fell upon Mo Guang. After that, he made a hand seal and channeled his spirit refinement technique, upon which several translucent threads shot out of his glabella before flying into Mo Guang's glabella, chest, dantian, and several other vital regions. Mo Guang gave a muffled groan as his face became slightly twisted with pain, but he merely suffered in silence. Some time later, the pain etched on his face faded, and Han Li removed his fingers from his own glabella as he declared, "These restrictions won't affect you in any way under normal circumstances, but once you enter the gray immortal's body, if you inadvertently fall under the control of its residual soul or something like that, and try to do something out of line, then those restrictions will activate on their own. If that happens, even I may not be able to react in time to stop the restrictions from taking effect. Rest assured, fellow Daoist Han, these restrictions will never have to take effect," Mo Guang said with a smile. "That would naturally be best. Before you begin refining the gray immortal's body into an avatar, I'll have to trouble you to give me a detailed rundown of the refinement process," Han Li said with a serious expression. Mo Guang nodded in response and did as he was told. Han Li listened to the refinement process that was being described while comparing it against the contents of the jade slip that he had been given by Mo Guang earlier, raising questions whenever there was something that he didn't understand. 3 days later, a triangular formation with black marrow crystals embedded onto it had taken shape at the bottom of the ravine. Han Li and Mo Guang were standing on either side of the formation, while the gray immortal's body was placed at its center. The two of them exchanged a glance, then sat down with their legs crossed in unison, making a hand seal while chanting a collective incantation. As the black marrow crystals in the formation began to lit up, a black flame that wasn't giving off any heat rose up at the center of the formation, enveloping the gray immortal's body to commence the refinement process. Close to a year passed by in the blink of an eye. The bottom of the ravine was teeming with baleful qi, and the triangular formation was completely enshrouded in a cloud of dense black mist. Han Li was seated with his legs crossed around 30 feet away from the formation, with a layer of azure light shimmering over his body, and waves of golden ripples were also spreading from his body, giving off peculiar energy fluctuations. Moments later, a burst of black baleful qi suddenly drifted out of his face, then flashed momentarily before vanishing again. Shortly thereafter, Han Li opened his eyes, and his pupils were glowing a bright silver color. Recently, his eyes had been periodically taking on this gray color, and the timing and duration for these bouts of eye color changes were seemingly completely haphazard. Furthermore, with each successive onset, Han Li could sense a burst of baleful qi deep in his consciousness, becoming stronger and stronger, while an unreasonable sense of aggression rose up in his heart. If it weren't for his tremendous spiritual sense, he would have most likely already fallen prey to this aggressive intent. Han Li exhaled as the layer of baleful qi over his face gradually faded, and his pupils also returned to normal, following which he closed his eyes to meditate once again. 2 months later, a burst of loud rumbling suddenly rang out from the bottom of the ravine, and the dense baleful qi there began to churn violently. The baleful qi rose up until it had almost spilled out of the entrance of the ravine, and a perplexed look appeared in the eyes of Taoist Zai as it observed the unfolding scene from above. At this moment, there was an enormous vortex of baleful qi that was swirling violently as it converged toward the center of the triangular formation. Outside the formation, Han Li and Mo Guang were standing with their hands clasped behind their backs, and both of them were looking rather weary. "My sincerest apologies, fellow Taoist Han. I thought that the refinement process would be complete in just 64 days. Never did I think that it would take this long," Mo Guang said, while intently scrutinizing the enormous baleful qi vortex at the center of the formation. It's fine, we still have enough time. How confident are you in your ability to complete the fusion process? Hanli asked as his gaze fell upon the gray, immortal body at the center of the formation. Compared with when it was first discovered, the body had grown significantly in stature, and it was also looking more supple and full of vitality. Its wizened and sensitive features had also become a lot softer, and it was finally beginning to resemble a living person. Truth be told, my chances of success are only at around 50%. If I can successfully take over this body, my cultivation base will rise all the way to the golden immortal stage, and I could even progress straight to the late golden immortal stage. However, if I fail, then I'll be trapped in this body, doomed to become sustenance for it, Mo Guang replied with a wry simile. Why did you propose this method if there's such a major element of risk involved? Han Li asked. I had no choice. Your cultivation base has been progressing at an extraordinary rate, and all of your spirit pets and puppets are also far more powerful than I am. Right now, I'm nothing more than a piece of redundant baggage for you. If I don't take this leap of faith, I'll eventually just be completely forgotten or abandoned altogether, Mo Guang sighed. That's a very interesting way of looking at things, Han Li replied in an ambiguous fashion. All right, here I go. Wish me luck, fellow Taoist Han, Mo Guang said, then flew into the swirling vortex as a black shadow. A resounding boom rang out, and the gray immortal's body at the center of the triangular formation suddenly sprang bolt upright. Its eyes were still a completely lifeless gray color, but its mouth had gaped open to an extreme extent. Han Li watched as Mo Guang flew headfirst into the body's mouth, quickly entering its belly as a stream of black mist. Immediately thereafter, the gray immortal's body began to tremble in an uncontrollable fashion, while moving its own limbs around erratically in a jerky and uncoordinated fashion. Furthermore, holes that resembled countless immortal acupoints had emerged all over its body, and they were devouring the black baleful chi in the ravine in a frenzy. This spectacle lasted an entire month before the vortex of baleful chi in the ravine finally disappeared, and at this point, the gray immortal's body had already returned to normal, but it was still hovering in midair in a completely still manner. Han Li was standing nearby, and he swept his spiritual sense over the body, only to find that it wasn't giving off any energy fluctuations. If it weren't for his connection to Mo Guang through their heavenly devil contract, he would have already been led to believe that Mo Guang had already been devoured by the gray immortal's body as sustenance. Han Li shook his head as he heaved a faint sigh. All of a sudden, he raised an eyebrow before sweeping a sleeve through the air to summon Jin Tong, then asked, "How did it go? Have you consolidated your cultivation base?" After eating the 2 pills you gave me, I've consolidated my current cultivation base, but I haven't been able to go any further beyond that, Jin Tong replied with a slightly disappointed expression. Han Li was rather amused by Jin Tong's disappointed expression, and he said, "The high zenith stage is a major hurdle that's extremely difficult to overcome. Just look at how those guys were fighting tooth and nail for high zenith pills back in the infernal frost immortal manner. All you had to do to reach the high zenith stage was eat half a skeleton. How could you still be unsatisfied?" 7 days ago, Jin Tong had suddenly awakened and reached the early high zenith stage. Furthermore, it seemed that she hadn't been afflicted by any of the 5 decays, much to Han Li's amazement. If only I could have reached the early high zenith stage. That way, we'd have a much easier time against that guy, Jin Tong sighed. A pang of sympathy welled up in Han Li's heart upon seeing this. It seemed that Jin Tong had been forced to mature a lot during the time that they had been pursued by the gold-devouring immortal. However, what Jin Tong said next immediately made him realize that she was still just the same greedy little girl as before. "This body looks really good, uncle. Should I eat it as well? Maybe that'll allow me to get to the mid-high zenith stage. This is the body of a gray immortal, and it's filled with baleful qi. Are you sure you want to eat it? Hanli asked with an exasperated expression. Jin Tong immediately began shaking her head vigorously upon hearing this. On second thoughts, I still haven't completely digested what I ate earlier. Xiao Bai has a much better appetite than I do, so it can have this body. Right at this moment, the sound of breathing suddenly rang out from the body, and Han Li hurriedly approached it to discover that its chest was heaving slightly as if it had begun breathing. Furthermore, its eyes had fallen shut, and its eyeballs were frantically darting around beneath its eyelids, as if it had fallen into some type of nightmare and was desperately trying to wake up, but to no avail. Jin Tong was very startled to see this, and she asked, "Why is this thing suddenly alive again? And by the looks of it, is it having a nightmare?" Han Li offered no response, and he suddenly recalled what he had seen back in the infernal frost immortal manor. At the time, Mo Yu's body had also been a living corpse, but it had been unable to awaken due to the lack of a soul. The fact that this body had been successfully resurrected meant that the refinement process and the integration of Mo Guang had been successful. But why was it still unconscious? What was the problem? After a prolonged period of deep thought, an enlightened look suddenly appeared in Han Li's eyes. Aside from the restoration of Mo Yu's soul, there had been one more vital contributing factor to the awakening of the body in the infernal frost immortal manner, and that was the origin void pill. Back then, Worm 3 had gone to great lengths to seek out Han Li to refine an origin void pill for her, and that definitely wasn't a pointless gesture. As it turned out, the origin void pill had played a pivotal role in Mo Yu's resurrection. With that in mind, Han Li immediately flipped a hand over to produce an origin void pill, then squeezed the gray immortal's cheeks between his fingers to force its mouth open before feeding it the pill. After that, Han Li retreated back to around 30 feet away to continue observing in silence. Jin Tong was rather perplexed to see this, but she didn't ask any questions as she also retreated back to a safe distance away with Han Li. A short while later, a loud burp rang out, and a plume of dense black smoke billowed out of the gray immortal's mouth. An apprehensive look appeared on Han Li's face upon seeing this, and he immediately dragged Jin Tong behind himself while channeling his spirit refinement technique. Right at this moment, Mo Guang's voice suddenly rang out from the gray immortal's body. "Don't attack, fellow Taoist Han, it's me." After that, the gray immortal's body began to move, shaking out its own limbs as if it were growing accustomed to itself. "Prove it," Han Li demanded in a cold voice, not letting down his guard in the slightest. Mo Guang hesitated momentarily, then made a hand seal before opening his mouth, releasing a cloud of inky black baleful qi, which transformed into a black scroll that slowly unfurled itself in front of Han Li. Han Li swept his spiritual sense over the scroll to discover that it was the heavenly devil contract that they had signed, but even so, he remained wary and vigilant. Mo Guang could sense the restrictions that had been planted in his body by Han Li's spirit refinement technique, and he opened his mouth to swallow the black scroll again, then sighed in a resigned manner. "Your cautious nature really will never change, will it, fellow Taoist Han? If I wasn't this cautious, Ma Liang would still be your contractual partner right now," Han Li said in an indifferent voice. "I didn't really think much about this in the beginning, but the more time I spend with you, the more I come to realize that the likes of Ma Liang really couldn't ever hope to hold a candle to you," Mo Guang said with a smile. "Instead of trying to flatter me, why don't you explain your current cultivation base? Why is it different from what you told me it would be?" Han Li asked in a cold voice. At this moment, Mo Guang was at the early high zenith stage, but his cultivation was constantly fluctuating like a flame that was swaying in the wind, unable to find any semblance of stability. Jin Tong could hear the animosity in Han Li's voice, and she didn't suppress her early high zenith stage aura any longer as she began glowering at Mo Guang with an unfriendly expression. Mo Guang hurriedly raised his hands in surrender upon seeing this, then explained, "Please don't misunderstand, fellow Taoist Li. Only after I entered this body did I realize that it was far more powerful than I anticipated. I had been completely suppressed by it, and if you hadn't fed me that pill in a timely fashion, I would have most likely already ceased to exist by now. The integration process has only just been completed, yet you're already at the early high zenith stage. It doesn't look to me like you were in any danger at all, fellow Daoist Mo Guang," Hanli countered in a skeptical fashion. "I'm only at the true immortal stage at the moment, so I was actually biting off far more than I could chew by trying to take over this body. As a result, my cultivation base is quite unstable at the moment. Once it stabilizes, I'll be back down to the late golden immortal stage. At the very most, I can only stay at the high zenith stage for a short time," Mo Guang replied with a wry smile. Through their spiritual connection, Han Li could sense that Mo Guang's aura was indeed gradually falling back down to the late golden immortal stage, and the apprehension in his heart finally faded. "It looks like you're telling the truth. In that case, I'll place my trust in you. Rest assured and take some time to recuperate. I'll keep a lookout for you," Han Li said. "You have my thanks," Mo Guang replied, then immediately sat down with his legs crossed and began to meditate. Ali. In the sky above an azure mountain range, a giant ball of semi-transparent white light was hovering in midair. The ball of light was several dozen acres in size, and there were waves of white light constantly rippling over its surface, presenting a kaleidoscope-like effect that entranced the beholder. The ball of light was extremely eye-catching, but none of the nearby demon beasts dared to approach it. On the contrary, all of them were frantically attempting to get as far away from it as possible. A giant golden beetle could be seen at the center of the ball of white light, and it was none other than the high zenith stage Gourd devouring Immortal. At this moment, it was completely still, as if it had been frozen in place, and its eyes were half open in a rather dreary fashion. Furthermore, a tiny white vortex could be seen swirling around in each of its pupils. If these white vortexes were to be magnified by 100-fold, one would discover that they were formed by countless specks of white light, within each of which was a flashing image. In one of the images, the gold-devouring Immortal had already returned to the insect race, and it had led the insect race army to eradicate all of the nearby beast race settlements, securing a vast amount of territory and resources in the process. Not long after that, another gold-devouring Immortal appeared in the primordial land in one of the other images. After some struggle, it was able to hunt down and devour this gold-devouring Immortal too. In an underground cave deep below the insect race's territory, the gold-devouring Immortal was curled up into a ball on a massive golden stone bed, and there was a pained look on its face. Its entire body was giving off extremely radiant golden light, alongside tremendous aura fluctuations that were undulating incessantly, while steadily trending up toward a bottleneck. Right at this moment, the aura fluctuations surging out of its body became even more violent, and they were crashing against the bottleneck like turbulent waves. With each wave that swept through the underground cave, it would tremble violently as countless rock shards came clattering down from above. Resounding booms rang out one after the other, and the intervals between them were steadily shrinking. All the while, the golden light radiating from the gold-devouring Immortal's body was becoming brighter and brighter, until it was as radiant as the sun. The golden light filled the entire underground cave, and it was rippling like water. Even though the walls of the cave had been reinforced by the gold-devouring Immortal, countless cracks were still appearing on their surfaces, and these cracks were gradually widening by the second. Right at this moment, a loud screeching sound suddenly rang out from within the golden light, following which a tremendous aura erupted forth. The surrounding underground cave was instantly completely destroyed without being able to put any resistance, and the entire mountain also disintegrated. Countless rocks of different sizes came plummeting out of the sky, only to instantly be repelled upon contact with the golden light. At this moment, there was a massive golden cocoon hovering at the center of the golden light, and it was riddled with profound golden patterns that were giving off formidable law-power fluctuations. The nearby world's origin chi converged in a frenzy to form balls of radiant golden light that were constantly streaming into the golden cocoon, making it thicker and thicker. At the same time, bursts of thunderous rumbling were ringing out incessantly within the cocoon, as if something terrifying were taking shape. Within the golden cocoon, the gold-devouring immortal had transformed into a tall and imposing man with bushy eyebrows and a square face that was riddled with golden patterns, presenting a rather peculiar sight to behold. Rays of golden light were constantly surging into the man's body from the surrounding golden cocoon, and his aura was still steadily elevating. I've finally returned to the great encompassment stage. The man roared with excitement as he threw his head back in exaltation, but right at this moment, his surroundings suddenly shuddered violently, following which a series of cracks emerged over the surrounding scene. In the end, the entire scene shattered like a pane of glass, then disintegrated into specks of translucent light. The man's ecstatic expression stiffened as he stood completely rooted to the spot. In the sky above the azure mountain range, the ball of white light began flashing erratically as countless white runes surged out of it. A dull thump then rang out as the ball of light abruptly exploded, scattering into countless specks of white spiritual light. The gold-devouring immortal shuddered as a hint of lucidity slowly returned to its glazed-over eyes, and the white vortexes deep within its pupils faded as it looked around with a bewildered expression. What happened? Haven't I already returned to the insect race and progressed to the great encompassment stage? What am I doing here? It roared in an alarmed and furious voice. All of a sudden, its expression stiffened as it cast its gaze forward. It had detected the aura of its target, the target that it was already supposed to have captured and devoured, and its aura had become significantly more powerful than before. Could it be that I fell prey to some type of illusion? The fury in the gold-devouring immortal's eyes gradually faded as it turned to inspect its surroundings. It was a calm and pleasant day with a warm breeze blowing over the azure mountain range, and there didn't appear to be anything amiss. The gold-devouring immortal quickly withdrew its gaze as a hesitant look appeared on its face. It raised one of its front limbs before extending it forward, and the golden light radiating from its body suddenly converged in front of it to form a circular golden formation. There were countless golden runes dancing within the formation, and it seemed that some type of secret technique was being used. All of a sudden, a stunned look appeared in the gold-devouring immortal's eyes as it exclaimed, "I've already been here for 20 years." A fearful look then appeared on its face as it hurriedly began scanning its surroundings again. The gold-devouring immortal had been residing in the primordial land for countless years, so it was naturally far more familiar with the primordial land than an outsider like Han Li. The insect race and the beast race were nothing more than insignificant races situated on the outskirts of the primordial land, while the true rulers of the land were the 4 monarch races. All of the 4 monarch races were extremely powerful and presided over enormous territories, claiming all of the regions of the primordial land with the most abundant spiritual chi. Furthermore, there were countless powerful beings among their ranks, including a whole host of golden immortals and jade immortals, and each of the four races was led by a great encompassment stage patriarch, the four of whom were collectively known as the Four Sages. The gold-devouring immortal was already at the late high zenith stage, so it didn't fear the four monarch races, but it was very much apprehensive of the four primordial sages. At this point, it had already entered the territory of one of the four monarch races, namely the almighty rat race. The gold-devouring immortal had come all this way in pursuit of Han Li and Jin Tong, but it had been inexplicably trapped here in an illusion for 20 years. 20 years was not a very long time, but the gold-devouring immortal knew that the only ones in the primordial land capable of trapping it in an illusion for this duration were the four sages. With that in mind, a contemplative look appeared in its eyes. It was said that Patriarch Gu of the almighty rat race was a mysterious figure who was barely ever in the primordial land, and he wasn't supposed to be particularly adept in illusions, either. Instead, the heavenly fox race, which directly neighbored the almighty rat race, was far more skilled in casting illusions. Could it be that the great encompassment stage patriarch of the heavenly fox race did this to me? But why? Is he trying to warn me not to set foot in the territory of the four monarch races? Countless thoughts were racing through the gold-devouring immortal's mind, but in the end, its greed won out over its caution, and it continued onward as a giant ball of golden light. Ali. Above the sheer cliff at the entrance of the dark ravine, two balls of light, one golden and one white, were hovering in midair, giving off tremendous auras. The balls of light contained none other than Jin Tong and Xiao Bai. Even though both of them had become significantly more powerful than before, they were still unable to acclimate themselves to the baleful qi at the bottom of the ravine, so they had come up to the surface to cultivate. Right at this moment, the ball of golden light suddenly faded to reveal Jin Tong, and she turned to a certain direction with a grim look on her face. Deep within the ravine, Han Li was seated with his legs crossed on a large rock, channeling his immortal spiritual power while assessing the state of the baleful qi in his own body. Mo Guang was also seated with his legs crossed nearby, and black light was flashing over his body as he continued to absorb the baleful qi in the surrounding area. Even though he had successfully taken over this body, further consolidation was still required to complete the integration process. At this moment, the body was looking even more supple than before. Its skin had become clean and smooth, while its previously wizened muscles had been completely filled out. Dressed in a black robe, it appeared no different from a normal person. All of a sudden, Han Li's eyes sprang open, and Jin Tong's voice rang out within his mind. "We've got trouble, uncle. That guy must have woken up and is coming after us right now." Han Li immediately rose to his feet upon hearing this, then took a moment to calculate the time, following which he murmured to himself, "It's been 20 years on the dot. Looks like that voice wasn't lying to me." He then turned to take a glance at Mo Guang, and he decided not to disturb Mo Guang from his cultivation as he began to ascend up the ravine as a streak of azure light. Mere moments following Han Li's departure, Mo Guang opened his eyes as he cast his gaze upward with a contemplative look in his eyes. It didn't take long before Han Li arrived on the cliff where Jin Tong was, and both Jin Tong and Xiao Bai were standing before him. "Uncle," Jin Tong began in a nervous voice, but didn't seem to know what to say. "Jin Tong, are you gold-devouring immortal fearful of baleful qi?" Han Li suddenly asked as he glanced at the dense baleful qi in the ravine. "Not really, but we definitely don't like baleful qi either," Jin Tong replied. "If it was possible for us to get away, we would have escaped from that gold-devouring immortal long ago. Seeing as we can't get away, we may as well just wait here for it and spare it the trouble of having to keep chasing after us," Han Li said with an amused smile. "My thoughts exactly, Both of us have become way more powerful than before, and we've got that phony Mo Guang as well. With all of our powers combined, I'm sure we'll be able to win. Jin Tong replied as her eyes lit up with excitement. Don't forget about me, Xiao Bai protested in an unconvincing voice. Oh yeah, we've got Xiao Bai as well. You should be able to withstand at least one attack, Jin Tong said as she patted Xiao Bai on the head. While it's true that all of us have become a lot more powerful, we can't afford to grow complacent in the face of a late high zenith stage gold devouring immortal. Jin Tong, how much longer will it take to get here? Hanli asked with a grim expression. At its current speed, it should be able to get here in about a month, Jin Tong replied. That should be enough time, Hanli murmured to himself upon hearing this. Jin Tong and Xiao Bai could tell that Hanli had a plan, and both of them were feeling much more reassured. Continue cultivating here in the meantime. Jin Tong, make sure to keep constant tabs on the gold devouring immortal, and tell me right away if anything changes, Hanli instructed. You can count on me, uncle, Jin Tong replied. After that, Hanli flew back into the ravine, and he quickly reached the bottom. Mo Guang had already gotten up from his cultivation, and upon spotting Hanli, he immediately rose to his feet before cupping his fist in a salute. Hanli briefly relayed what he had been told by Jin Tong to Mo Guang, then added, "We'll be requiring your power to oppose the gold-devouring immortal, fellow Taoist Mo Guang. I'm happy to help. I'll begin preparing right away. I can't promise too much, but at the very least, I should be able to maintain my high zenith stage powers for 15 minutes when it comes time to battle," Mo Guang replied. That's good to hear, Hanli said with a smile, while Mo Guang returned to his seated cultivation. A contemplative look appeared on Hanli's face, and swept a sleeve through the air to summon a large stack of formation tools of different colors, while Taoist Zai also appeared beside him amid a flash of golden light. Taoist Zai, please help me set up these formations here, Hanli said. Taoist Zai nodded in response, then took some of the formation tools from Hanli and the two of them. The two of them were busy at work for close to half a month before completing the formations. At this moment, Hanli was hovering in midair while chanting an incantation, and specks of light were flashing incessantly throughout the entire ravine. Bursts of tremendous power were also surging through the area, some of which were extremely hard and strong, while others were more soft and resilient, and they were all working together to stir up the surrounding baleful qi. All of a sudden, all of the specks of light and the bursts of power faded, leaving no trace behind, and the unrest in the baleful qi also quickly subsided. Hanli gave a pleased nod upon seeing this, then descended to the bottom of the ravine, where he sat down with his legs crossed before sweeping a sleeve through the air, summoning a series of immortal treasures, all of which were glowing radiantly while giving off bursts of law power fluctuations. Hanli picked up these immortal treasures before examining them one by one, making some final preparations for the upcoming battle. He had already done everything that he could to brace himself for the imminent storm, but the opponent was going to be a late high zenith stage gold devouring immortal, so he had to be extra meticulous. After carefully examining all of the immortal treasures, he stowed them away again, and all that was left on the ground at this moment was the profound heavenly gourd. Hanli observed the gourd for a moment, then picked it up and began to examine its opening. That part was still lighter in coloration than the rest of the gourd, but it had become a lot darker than before, and the green light emanating from the gourd had also become brighter. A faint smile appeared on Hanli's face upon seeing this. Even though he had been fleeing from the gold-devouring immortal this entire time, he had made sure to consistently water the gourd using the spirit liquid from the heaven-controlling vial, and it was clearly working. At this rate, it should be able to reach full maturity in no more than a century. Han Li examined the gourd for a moment longer, then opened his mouth to release a burst of azure light that vanished into it. A layer of countless tiny runes instantly emerged over its surface, and the runes were constantly flowing like water while releasing bursts of law power fluctuations that kept all of the baleful qi within a radius of several dozen feet at bay. Han Li took a deep breath before closing his eyes, then injected his spiritual sense into the glowing green gourd, arriving in the green space within. The green space didn't appear to be any different from before. It was still filled with countless wisps of green light, which were slowly revolving to form a green vortex. However, these wisps of green light were clearly a bit brighter than before, and they were also giving off a very peculiar aura. This was most likely the result of the nourishing effect of the heaven-controlling vial's spirit liquid. Hovering at the center of the green vortex were several azure bamboo cloudswarm swords, as well as that miniature pagoda immortal treasure that he had obtained from the infernal frost immortal manor. After so many years of refinement, the spiritual power of the azure bamboo cloudswarm swords had become completely self-contained, and they were giving off faint azure spiritual light, seemingly no different in appearance from normal spirit treasures. As for the azure bamboo cloudswarm sword that had been placed into the gourd first, its spiritual power had become restrained to the extreme, to the point that it wasn't even glowing with spiritual light anymore, making it resemble an ordinary mortal sword. However, through his spiritual connection with the sword, Han Li could sense that it contained tremendous spiritual power that could be unleashed at any moment at his behest. After withdrawing his spiritual sense from the gourd, Han Li opened his eyes before sweeping a sleeve through the air, and one of the flying swords emerged from the gourd, then landed in his grasp. After catching the flying sword, Han Li injected some of his immortal spiritual power into it, and an earth-shattering thunderclap instantly rang out as a vast expanse of radiant golden lightning erupted forth. Countless thin arcs of lightning also sprang out of the sword in all directions, instantly encompassing the entire surrounding area. These arcs of lightning were extremely bright, and all of the nearby baleful qi instantly surged back in retreat to avoid them. A pleased look appeared on Han Li's face upon seeing this. Sure enough, following this period of refinement in the profound heavenly gourd, all of the azure bamboo cloudswarm swords had become significantly more powerful than before. Immediately thereafter, 8 more azure bamboo cloudswarm swords flew out of the gourd at Han Li's behest, and they rose up into the air along with the one that was already in his hand. The 9 swords circled around in midair as thick arcs of golden lightning emerged over them amid rumbling thunderclaps, and the space in the wake of the 9 flying swords was also trembling and rippling violently. Ever since Han Li reached the late golden immortal stage, he had become able to control as many as 9 azure bamboo cloudswarm swords at once, and that was undoubtedly a massive boost to his power. The 9 azure bamboo cloudswarm swords circled around in midair momentarily, then returned to the gourd at Han Li's behest. As for the miniature pavilion immortal treasure, its spiritual power had also become more self-contained, but it hadn't changed to anywhere near as significant an extent as the azure bamboo cloudswarm swords, perhaps because it was simply a treasure of an inferior caliber. After directing the 9 flying swords back into the gourd, Han Li rose to his feet as he observed the gourd with a hint of excitement in his eyes. In the next instant, he raised a hand to toss the gourd up into the air, then cast a rapid string of incantation seals into it, and the green light emanating from the gourd instantly brightened, while the green runes began to revolve at a blinding speed. All of a sudden, a thick beam of translucent light shot out of his glabella before vanishing into the gourd in a flash. With his recent cultivation-based progression and his mastery of the 4th level of the spirit refinement technique, His spiritual sense had become far more powerful than before, and he wanted to try and refine this treasure to see if he could make some progress. This gourd was an extraordinarily rare and powerful, profound heavenly treasure, and Han Li was confident that it was definitely capable of more than just purifying the spiritual power of treasures stored within it. With that in mind, Han Li continued cycling through a string of hand seals, injecting more and more immortal spiritual power into the gourd. At the same time, he released his spiritual sense deep into the internal space within the gourd, but it didn't take long before he encountered some resistance in the form of a gentle yet resilient barrier that kept his spiritual sense at bay. This was the same resistance that he had encountered during his previous attempt to explore the internal space of the gourd with his spiritual sense, but the resistance was significantly weaker than before. This was naturally very encouraging to Han Li, and he hurriedly channeled his spirit refinement technique, extending his spiritual sense deeper and deeper into the gourd. Even though progress was very slow, his spiritual sense was still constantly advancing. With every single inch of progress that was made, a huge amount of spiritual sense had to be expended, but Han Li was determined to persevere. All of a sudden, the green light emanating from the gourd began to flash erratically, and bursts of formidable law power fluctuations surged forth, stirring up the nearby baleful qi into a frenzy once again. Han Li paid no heed to this as he focused wholeheartedly on advancing his spiritual sense further and further into the green vortex, and 2 whole hours passed by in a flash. Right as Han Li's spiritual sense was whittled down to past the halfway mark, a faint yet clearly audible cracking sound rang out from within the green gourd, as if some type of bottleneck had been broken. The resistance that Han Li's spiritual sense was encountering instantly fell away, and it entered another green space. At the same time, the resistance in the path of his immortal spiritual power also faded, allowing it to flow effortlessly into the gourd. At the same time, the flashing green light around the gourd suddenly settled down again, but it had become brighter than before, as was the case with the green runes on the surface of the gourd. Han Li didn't dare to let his guard down as he carefully advanced his immortal spiritual power deeper and deeper into the gourd, but most of his attention was still focused on his spiritual sense. The green space that his spiritual sense had entered appeared to be very similar to HTE space from before, but this space was larger than the previous one. However, this space was completely empty, with the exception of a ball of green light hovering in midair. The ball of green light was flashing occasionally, and it seemed to be very mysterious. A hint of curiosity welled up in Han Li's heart upon seeing this, and he immediately began inspecting this green space with his spiritual sense. It didn't take long before his spiritual sense explored the entire space, but there was nothing special in it aside from the ball of green light. Han Li turned his attention back to the ball of green light, and after a brief hesitation, he extended his spiritual sense toward it. However, as soon as his spiritual sense came into contact with the ball of green light, it immediately brightened significantly while rippling like a green fireball. Immediately thereafter, a resounding boom rang out as a burst of tremendous power erupted out of the ball of light to forcefully repel Han Li's spiritual sense. Han Li was instantly struck by a rush of dizziness, and he hurriedly channeled his spirit refinement technique to steady himself as a surprised look appeared on his face. After taking a moment to compose himself, he increased his spiritual sense output as he attempted to examine the ball of green light again. But just like last time, his spiritual sense was repelled once again. However, he was mentally prepared on this occasion, so he wasn't struck by the same rush of dizziness, but he was still quite astonished, nonetheless. Unwilling to give up, Han Li continued to extend his spiritual sense toward the ball of green light, even turning to his spiritual sense chains, spiritual sense cage, and sword observation arts. But his efforts were thwarted every single time. In the end, he had no choice but to withdraw his spiritual sense. In the meantime, his immortal spiritual power had managed to make some progress, but it had once again encountered some resistance. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face as he observed the green gourd. Even though he wasn't able to get to the bottom of its secrets, his control over the gourd had improved significantly. With that in mind, he released his spiritual sense to enter the first green space within the gourd, and the green vortex instantly sped up in its revolution, releasing a burst of bright green light that struck a nearby mountain face. A deep indentation appeared on the mountain face as the section of rock struck by the burst of green light vanished into thin air, having been sucked into the gourd. Han Li gave a nod of approval upon seeing this. After countless years of direct contact with the immense baleful qi in the ravine, the rock face had become extremely hard, so it was quite remarkable that the green light had been able to tear through it so easily. It seemed that, as the green vortex sped up in its revolution, its ability to suck in objects had become significantly enhanced. The chunk of rock that was sucked into the gourd appeared at the center of the green vortex, and as soon as it was encompassed within the green light, it immediately folded together like putty into a ball of black rock. As the vortex continued to speed up in its revolution at Han Li's behest, the green light it was releasing became brighter and brighter. The green light swept over the bottom of the ravine, and everything that it came into contact with was torn apart before being sucked into the gourd. At this point, Han Li's complexion had paled slightly, and he withdrew his spiritual sense from the gourd. Using a profound heavenly treasure was extremely taxing, and most of his immortal spiritual power had been exhausted in this brief span of time. Only after taking a pill did his complexion gradually begin to improve, upon which he immediately extended his spiritual sense into the first green space within the gourd once again. At this point, the green vortex had already returned to its normal slow and languid speed of revolution. Previously, Han Li had been unable to control the vortex at all, but now he was able to speed up and slow down its rate of revolution at will. As he continued to observe the vortex, a thought suddenly occurred to him, and he decided to see what would happen if he made the vortex spin in reverse.